Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will make your radiator, your soft mattress and your unlocked front door feel like the height of luxury. We are stepping into the cold, echoing corridors of the Victorian prison system, a place engineered not just to punish the body, but to quietly, deliberately, systematically break the mind. Forget the swashbuckling escape movies and the lovable rogue in a striped shirt soaring through bars with a spoon. Victorian prison reformers did not particularly want you to escape. They wanted you to sit very still, in total silence, in a stone box roughly the size of a modern parking space, and think very hard about what you had done, for years, without so much as a friendly nod from the fellow in the next cell. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this sort of thing, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. It is always oddly comforting to picture a little map of everyone drifting off together while we talk about the historical horrors of solitary confinement. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get yourself properly tucked in, because tonight it is a long, slow one. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to spend 23 hours a day utterly alone? Forbidden to speak, in a cell so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat like a ticking clock. Have you ever wondered what it does to a grown adult to be marched to the exercise yard wearing a cap with a deep peak pulled down over the eyes, or a full cloth mask so that you cannot even look at another human face? Have you ever wondered why turning a crank handle 10,000 times a day for absolutely no productive purpose whatsoever was considered rehabilitation? Or why climbing a wheel that goes nowhere for 6 hours was thought to improve your moral character? Have you ever wondered what prison bread actually tasted like, whether picking apart old tarry rope with your bare fingers for 10 hours really does build character, or whether a chaplain's Sunday sermon can save a soul that has not been permitted to speak a single word since last Tuesday? Have you ever wondered how you say good morning to a stranger using only your eyebrows? Because that is a skill you are about to develop out of pure necessity. Stick with me, and we will answer every single one of those questions before the night is through, slowly, gently, and in far more detail than is strictly good for you. Congratulations, you have just woken up in England in the autumn of 1853, and you are, as of roughly 4 hours ago, a convicted prisoner of Her Majesty the Queen. The first thing you notice is the sound of the wheels on cobblestone, an uneven rattling clatter that seems to travel straight up through the floor of the prison van and into your back teeth. You are shackled at the wrists, seated on a hard wooden bench inside what the Victorians cheerfully nicknamed Black Maria, a windowless carriage divided into narrow closet-sized compartments so that you cannot see, speak to, or even acknowledge the existence of the other prisoners rattling along beside you toward the same grim address. It is, in its own way, the opening chapter of the entire philosophy you are about to be subjected to for the next several years. Separation begins before you have even arrived. You strain to catch a glimpse of daylight through a slat no wider than a coin, and you catch instead the outline of high brick walls rising up ahead of you like a cliff face that someone built on purpose, with a gatehouse crouched in the middle of it looking distinctly unimpressed to see you. This is not a building designed to welcome anyone. It is designed to be seen from a mile away and to make the average Londoner walking past mutter a quiet prayer of thanks that they remembered to pay their rent this month. The prison you are approaching, let us say Pentonville, opened only a decade or so earlier in 1842, was considered the shining new model of what a prison ought to be, where older institutions like the crumbling, chaotic Newgate had thrown debtors, murderers, pickpockets, and the merely unlucky into communal cells together to swap stories, diseases, and criminal tips like it was some sort of ghastly finishing school. Pentonville was built on an entirely different theory: separation, silence, reflection. You are not being sent here to mingle with hardened criminals and pick up new skills, at least that is the official line. You are being sent here to be alone with your own thoughts until your thoughts, presumably, sort themselves out. The gate itself groans open on hinges that sound like they have not been oiled since the coronation, and you are walked through a small door cut into the enormous main gate. The kind of door that makes the whole structure feel less like a building and more like the closing scene of your old life. Somewhere behind you, London carries on exactly as it did 5 minutes ago, indifferent to the fact that you have just vanished into a system that was, quite proudly, designed by men who believed that discomfort was the fastest route to a reformed soul. You glance up at the walls one more time, noting with a sinking feeling that they seem taller from directly underneath them than they did from the van, the way a hill always looks steeper once you are the one walking up it. A warder, brisk, unsmiling, and entirely unbothered by your obvious dread, takes hold of your arm with the gentle firmness of a man loading furniture onto a cart, and steers you forward into the shadow of the gatehouse. You will learn in time that this walk from the gate to the reception block is the last unstructured moment of freedom your feet will ever again enjoy on this particular stretch of English soil, at least for a good long while. Behind you, the enormous door swings shut, with a sound that is somehow both a clang and a thud at once, final and metallic, and entirely lacking in sympathy for your situation. Ahead of you lies the reception block, low, brick, and smelling faintly of carbolic soap, and something else you cannot quite place yet, but will come to know intimately. Around you, other new arrivals shuffle in the same direction, each one carefully prevented from looking too closely at the others, each one privately doing the same mental arithmetic you are doing right now, counting days, counting years, wondering whether the person they were yesterday will still exist by the time they walk back out through that same gate. It occurs to you somewhat late in the process that nobody warned you prison design would have this much thought put into it. You had rather assumed a prison was just a large box with locks on it. Instead, you are being quietly, architecturally, psychologically prepared, and you have not even had breakfast yet. The Victorians, it turns out, were nothing if not thorough. Every stone in that wall, every narrow slit of a window, every silent yard of cobbled path between the gate and the reception hall has been placed with a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose is not your comfort. Somewhere inside, a clerk is already turning to a fresh page in a ledger, dipping a pen, and waiting to reduce you, quite literally, to a number. But that particular indignity is still a few minutes away. For now you simply walk, flanked by brick, beneath a sky you will not see properly again for longer than you would like to think about, and you try, without much success, to convince yourself that this cannot possibly be as bad as it looks. It is, dear listener, at least as bad as it looks. In some rather specific and creative ways, it is worse, and we are only just getting started. There is a strange, almost administrative calm to the way the whole procession moves, and that calm is, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling detail of all. Nobody shouts. Nobody threatens you with anything more dramatic than a clipboard. The warders who flank you, and the other new arrivals shuffling toward the reception block, behave with the bored, practised efficiency of men herding livestock through a familiar gate, which is, when you think about it, precisely what they are doing. Only the livestock in question happens to be capable of dread, of memory, of a rising, useless panic that has nowhere at all to go. You glance sideways, carefully, at the man walking a few paces ahead of you, noting the particular slump of his shoulders, the way his eyes flick nervously toward the walls the same way yours do, and you feel for one brief, unguarded moment something like companionship with a total stranger you are not permitted to speak to, and will very likely never see again once you are both sorted into your separate wings. It occurs to you that this fleeting, wordless solidarity, exchanged purely through posture and stolen glances, is probably the last genuinely spontaneous human connection you will experience for quite some time, and you tuck the small comfort of it away somewhere private, the way you might pocket a coin you found in the street, uncertain when you might need it again, but instinctively certain that you will. The prison van itself, you later learn from a fellow prisoner, communicated to entirely through gestures and lip shapes rather than actual forbidden words, was a fairly recent innovation, older transport methods having involved marching chained gangs of prisoners openly through the streets. A practice increasingly abandoned by the middle of the century, partly out of a genuine, if belated, concern for basic decency, and partly because reform-minded officials had grown uncomfortable with the way public parading of prisoners seemed to encourage exactly the sort of jeering, rowdy crowd behaviour the whole moral reform project was supposedly working against. There is a certain grim irony, you think, in a system so obsessed with your own private, invisible reformation nonetheless, having once considered your public humiliation a perfectly reasonable part of the journey. And you find yourself grateful, in a small, complicated way, that at least this particular indignity has been quietly retired before your own turn came to make the trip. The gatehouse looming ahead of you, you later come to learn from a chaplain fond of architectural trivia during one of his rounds, was deliberately designed by men who studied prison architecture across the continent, borrowing ideas from radial layouts pioneered elsewhere and adapting them to English soil with a particular Victorian enthusiasm for combining moral theory with brick and mortar. The whole building, gatehouse included, was meant to communicate a message before you had even set foot inside it. Order, authority, permanence. The unmistakable visual promise that whatever chaos led you here, none of that chaos would be tolerated 1 inch beyond this threshold. You find yourself almost admiring the architectural confidence of the thing, even as you deeply resent everything it represents about the next several years of your life. The reception room is where whoever you used to be gets quietly, efficiently, and permanently misplaced. You are led into a low-ceilinged chamber, tiled in that particular shade of institutional green the Victorians seemed to love for anywhere unpleasant was scheduled to happen, and told, without much ceremony, to remove your clothes. All of them, right here in front of a warder who has clearly seen this exact scene play out several thousand times before and finds nothing remarkable about it whatsoever. You fumble with buttons that suddenly feel enormous and complicated, acutely aware that dignity, that small comfortable thing you carried around unconsciously your whole life, is being folded up and set aside along with your coat. Your clothes, the ones you arrived in, the ones that still smell faintly of your own home, your own soap, your own life, are itemized on a card, wrapped, tagged with a number, and stored away in a warehouse of identical bundles belonging to identical strangers, not to be seen again until the day you are released, if you are released. And if moths have been merciful, standing there in the open air of an institutional room, you understand for the first time just how much of your personality was actually being carried by your waistcoat. Next comes the search. Brisk, impersonal, thorough in the way that only a bureaucracy genuinely committed to thoroughness can manage. Pockets, seams, the inside of your boots, all of it checked for the sort of contraband that new arrivals apparently still try to smuggle in with startling regularity. Tobacco mostly, sometimes a coin, occasionally a note meant for someone already inside. You are asked to open your mouth. You comply, because at this stage in proceedings you would comply with almost anything short of actual bodily harm, and even that seems negotiable. Then comes the bath, a tub of grey lukewarm water shared, in spirit if not in fact, with every other frightened, shivering new admission who bathed in it that morning before you. It is not there to relax you. It is there to strip off the last physical residue of the outside world, and, not incidentally, to make sure you are not harbouring livestock. Lice, fleas, and the various other tiny stowaways that travelled with the Victorian poor were a genuine and constant institutional concern, and the prison authorities had absolutely no interest in importing them into their tidy new model establishment. You are handed a rough grey towel, that has clearly dried several dozen prisoners before you and told to hurry along, because the queue behind you is not getting any shorter and the clerk with a ledger is starting to look at his pocket watch. Once dry, or as dry as one can reasonably become under the circumstances, you are examined by the prison surgeon, a brief clinical inspection intended less to preserve your well-being out of any particular affection for you, and more to establish, for the official record, that you arrived in a condition fit to withstand whatever comes next. Your height is measured. Your weight is noted. Any distinguishing marks, scars, tattoos picked up on some ill-advised evening years ago are catalogued with the flat, unromantic precision of a man cataloguing furniture. You are, from this point forward, a set of measurements and a case number, rather than a face anyone particularly needs to remember. It is a strange kind of relief, honestly. Discovering that terror this specific eventually just becomes procedure, something to be moved through, rather than something to be felt in its full weight, because feeling the full weight of it would rather get in the way of the timetable. The whole reception process, from gate to gown, is designed to run like clockwork. And clockwork, as you are quickly learning, does not pause for anyone's feelings. By the time you are handed your first item of prison clothing, still damp from the wash, still smelling of carbolic and someone else's institutional history, you have been awake for perhaps 5 hours and have already been shackled, transported, stripped, searched, bathed in communal water of questionable temperature, and measured like a length of timber. And you have not yet so much as seen the inside of your cell. The Victorian reformers who designed this system genuinely believed that stripping a man of his old identity was the first necessary step toward building a better one in its place. Whether they were right about that is a question historians still argue over politely in academic journals. What is not in dispute is that by the time you leave that green-tiled room, you no longer look, smell, or feel like the person who climbed into the prison van that morning. And there is something almost impressively efficient about how quickly an institution can accomplish that particular transformation when it truly puts its mind to it. You notice, too, the peculiar choreography of the whole reception process, the way each stage flows seamlessly into the next without ever once pausing to ask how you are managing emotionally, as though the very architecture of the room has been designed to prevent you from having a spare moment in which to actually feel anything. The clerk behind the desk barely glances up as he processes your paperwork, dipping his pen with the same unhurried rhythm of a man who has filled in this exact form several thousand times before you, and will fill it in several thousand times more after you have gone. And there is a strange comfort buried somewhere inside that indifference. The realization that whatever catastrophe currently feels like the entire collapse of your personal universe is, from where he sits, simply Tuesday. A fellow new arrival 2 places behind you in the queue begins, quietly and without much conviction, to argue that a mistake has clearly been made, that he does not belong here, and the warder nearest him responds with nothing more than a flat, weary glance that somehow conveys, more effectively than any words could, that he has heard this particular protest roughly as many times as the clerk has filled in that particular form, and that it has never once, in the history of this institution, changed a single outcome. You are struck, too, by the sheer volume of paperwork generated purely by your own admission, form after form recording your height, your weight, your previous convictions, if any, your trade, your literacy, a whole small biography assembled not for anyone who might actually care about you as a person, but purely for the administrative convenience of an institution that needs, above all else, to keep track of exactly which body occupies exactly which cell at exactly which stage of exactly which sentence. It occurs to you that you have, within the space of a single morning, generated more official documentation about yourself than you produced across your entire previous life, a strange kind of bureaucratic immortality achieved through the least flattering possible circumstances imaginable. The bathwater itself, you notice with a certain grim fascination, carries a faint grey film by the time your turn arrives, evidence of every anxious travel-worn body that queued ahead of you this same morning, and you lower yourself into it anyway, because the alternative, remaining unwashed and therefore ineligible to proceed to the next stage of processing, is simply not an option available to you. You reflect, scrubbing carefully at hands that still carry the dust of whatever journey brought you here, that this particular indignity, shared wordlessly with dozens of equally reluctant strangers, is perhaps the closest thing to genuine camaraderie the reception process permits. Everyone equally cold, equally embarrassed, equally eager for it to be over. Somewhere between the bath and the cell door, you stop being a name and start being a sequence of digits, and nobody bothers to soften the news. A clerk seated behind a high desk with the unhurried patience of a man who does this exact task roughly a dozen times before his midday tea, reads out your new designation, something like B 2 4 17, and informs you, not unkindly but not warmly either, that this is now how you will be addressed, referred to, and recorded for the entire duration of your sentence. Your actual name, the one your mother used when you were small, the one that appeared on your baptism record and your marriage lines and every letter you ever received, is filed away in the same ledger as your clothing and, functionally speaking, retired from active use. It feels, at first, like an administrative footnote, a minor inconvenience alongside the far larger inconvenience of imprisonment itself. It does not stay feeling minor for long. You are handed a small metal tag or a printed card bearing your number, sometimes stitched or stamped directly onto your uniform, and you quickly discover that warders use it constantly, briskly, without any particular malice, but also without any particular warmth, the way you might refer to a filing cabinet by its drawer number. Move along, B2417. Face the wall, B2417. It does something curious to the mind, hearing yourself reduced to an alphanumeric string dozens of times a day, every day, for months or years on end. Psychologists a century and a half later would have plenty to say about the deliberate erosion of identity as a control mechanism, but the Victorian prison reformers arrived at roughly the same conclusion through sheer instinct and institutional efficiency. A man who no longer thinks of himself by name is, in some small but meaningful way, easier to manage, easier to discipline, easier to fit neatly into a system built entirely around uniformity. You try in the beginning to hold on to your name privately, repeating it to yourself in your cell like a little incantation against dissolving entirely into the machinery around you. Some prisoners keep this habit their whole sentence. Others, and this is the genuinely unsettling part, eventually stop bothering, because after enough months of being called nothing else, the old name starts to feel like something that belonged to a stranger. The number itself becomes attached to everything you own and everything you do inside these walls. Your uniform bears it. Your cell door bears a corresponding plate. Your rations are logged against it. Your labour output, whether it is oakum picked or revolutions of a crank turned, is tallied against it in yet another ledger, in yet another office, by yet another clerk who will never meet you and has no particular interest in doing so. There is something almost hilariously bureaucratic about the whole apparatus once you step back and look at it. An entire nation building elaborate paperwork systems around the daily suffering of individual human beings, filing it all neatly away, in triplicate as though moral reformation was simply a matter of sufficiently rigorous record-keeping. And yet the psychological effect on you, the actual living person underneath the number, is anything but funny. Being systematically stripped of your name is one small brick in a much larger wall the Victorian system is building around your sense of self. A wall constructed with genuine, if badly misguided, conviction that anonymity and repetition would somehow scrub the criminal impulse clean out of you. the way lye soap scrubs a stain out of linen. You will spend the coming months responding to a number the way a dog responds to a whistle, promptly, automatically, and with a small flicker of something that used to be pride, now buried somewhere under compliance. Occasionally, late at night, lying on your narrow plank bed, you will find yourself whispering your actual name into the darkness just to confirm it still belongs to you. It does technically. The prison ledger, however, remains entirely unconvinced, and the prison ledger, as you are rapidly discovering, is the only opinion that currently matters. There is a particular indignity, too, in discovering just how quickly your own brain adapts to answering by number rather than name, a small betrayal by your own mind that you did not entirely see coming. Within a fortnight, you find yourself turning your head automatically at the sound of your designation called down the gallery, the same instinctive, unthinking response your old name used to produce, and the speed of that adaptation frightens you rather more than the number itself ever did. You begin, in idle moments, to wonder about the other men sharing your gallery, B2416 and B2418, whose actual names you will likely never learn despite living in the closest possible physical proximity to them for months or years on end. Two human beings reduced to consecutive digits, purely by the accident of which cells happen to be assigned to you both on the same reception morning. It is a strange, quietly melancholy thought, that an entire small community of suffering, isolated men exists all around you, each with a name, a history, a family somewhere worrying after him, and that the institution has arranged things so precisely that none of you will ever be permitted to learn even that most basic fact about one another. Some prisoners, you gather, take a strange quiet comfort in the anonymity of the numbering system, reasoning that a man who is nobody in particular to the institution is also, in some small private way, protected from the institution's fuller judgment, his actual history, his actual failings, his actual name reduced to a footnote nobody bothers reading closely. You are not yet certain whether you find that thought comforting, or simply one more small additional loss to add to the considerable pile already accumulating since your arrival, but you notice, turning it over during the long silent hours of your labour, that it is the first time since your conviction that anonymity has struck you as something other than purely a punishment. You practice, in the privacy of your own cell, saying your number aloud under your breath, testing its unfamiliar rhythm against your tongue, the way you might once have practiced a foreign phrase before an important conversation, determined that if you must answer to it several dozen times a day, you will at least master it thoroughly enough that no hesitation ever betrays how strange it still feels. It becomes, oddly, a small private discipline you take some pride in, this deliberate fluency, one of the very few skills this institution has asked of you that you can genuinely choose to perform well rather than simply endure. Standing in your cell for the first time, holding a folded bundle of scratchy grey wool, you understand with total clarity that fashion, as a concept, has officially left the building. The uniform handed to you at reception is coarse, undyed or dull grey broadcloth, stiff with newness and utterly indifferent to the actual shape of your body. Sizing, as a system of individual measurement and tailored comfort, does not really apply here. You are issued a jacket, trousers, a cap, and if you are lucky, a reasonably intact pair of boots, all pulled from a general stock sorted loosely by approximate size rather than fitted to you personally. So you either swim in your trousers or find your jacket sleeves stopping a good few inches short of your wrists, and either way the effect is the same. Faintly ridiculous and entirely without dignity. Stamped or printed across the fabric, usually in a darker contrasting colour, is the famous broad arrow, that unmistakable government issue symbol that has marked convict property in Britain since long before your admission, and will continue marking it long after your release, assuming there is enough of your original personality left by then to notice or care. The arrow is not subtle. It is not meant to be. Every inch of your clothing announces to anyone who might glimpse you what you are now, a number wrapped in scratchy wool marked as government property in the same visual language used for military stores and mailbags. You dress slowly, awkwardly, aware of a warder standing nearby, with the patient boredom of a man supervising a task he has already watched thousands of times, and you notice almost immediately that the wool itches, properly itches, in a way your old clothes never did. A constant low-grade irritation against your skin that you will simply have to learn to stop noticing. Because nobody is going to offer you a replacement fabric out of consideration for your comfort. The trousers in particular seem to have been designed by someone who had heard a rumour about human legs rather than ever actually measured one, and you spend your first morning hitching them up at regular intervals like a man perpetually about to wade into a river. What strikes you most, though, once the initial itching subsides into background noise, is the uniform's deeper function, which has very little to do with keeping you warm, and everything to do with keeping you visible, identifiable, and thoroughly stripped of any last trace of personal style. Out in the world, your clothing said something about you. Your trade, your income, your taste, even your mood on a given morning. In here, everyone wears the same grey. Everyone marches the same shuffling walk enforced by ill-fitting boots. Everyone becomes, at a passing glance, functionally interchangeable, a sea of identical broad-arrowed figures moving through identical corridors. And there is something quietly devastating about that particular kind of sameness, once it truly sinks in. It is not merely that you have lost your possessions, it is that you have lost the visual language of being a distinct individual at all, swapped out for a costume specifically engineered to erase you into a category rather than preserve you as a person. Some prisoners find, oddly, a strange comfort in this uniformity, a sense that at least here, stripped of every marker of former status, the wealthy swindler and the desperate labourer stand equally itchy and equally anonymous before the same institution. Most prisoners simply find it humiliating, day after day, the scratch of cheap wool against the neck, a constant physical reminder of exactly how far they have fallen from whatever life they were living the week before. You will wear this uniform, or one very much like it, laundered occasionally in vast institutional batches that do very little to improve its texture for the entire length of your sentence. By the time you are eventually issued your own clothes again on the day of your release, you will have half forgotten what it feels like to wear something chosen rather than assigned, and you will spend a strange, disorienting first afternoon of freedom simply marvelling at the sensation of a shirt that actually fits. A small and quietly moving reminder of just how much the little things matter once every single one of them has been taken away from you for years on end. In the meantime, though, there are smaller, stranger indignities to contend with, chief among them the discovery that the prison cap, that famous deep-peaked accessory you will come to know intimately during exercise yard, sits on your head with all the elegance of an upturned coal scuttle, and that the boots, sized by some rough approximation of a standard foot that apparently belongs to nobody, currently residing in this institution, produce blisters within the first hour of wear, regardless of whether they run too large or too small. You watch during your first clumsy morning in uniform, as a fellow prisoner a few cells down attempts a kind of makeshift alteration, tucking and rolling his trouser cuffs in a manner that earns him a sharp word from a passing warder for tampering with government property. And you understand, watching the exchange, that even the small private dignity of making your ill-fitting clothes marginally less absurd has been quietly placed off limits. You settle eventually for simply enduring the itch, the sag, the general sensation of wearing a costume assembled by someone actively working against your comfort, and you reflect that this too, this daily small humiliation repeated every single morning as you dress, is doing exactly the quiet, patient work the system's architects always intended it to do. You notice too a curious levelling effect the uniform produces among prisoners of wildly different backgrounds, the gentleman swindler who arrived in fine tailored wool, now wearing precisely the same coarse grey broadcloth as the labourer convicted of poaching. Both of them equally itchy, equally ill-fitted, equally marked with the same broad arrow, and you find something almost satisfying in that particular flattening of former distinctions, even as you recognize it as simply one more deliberate mechanism for stripping away whatever remained of your former identity. Wealth, it turns out, buys you nothing at all once you are standing in the reception block holding a bundle of scratchy grey wool. A small bitter equality that the outside world, with all its careful gradations of status and privilege, never quite manages to offer anyone. You notice, examining the coarse stitching along your jacket's seams during an idle moment, the unmistakable evidence of other prison workshops in its construction, the same broad. Functional stitches you yourself will soon be producing on mailbags of your own. An entire quiet economy of convicts clothing convicts, stretching across the country in a closed, self-sufficient loop that never once requires the involvement of an honest tailor. It strikes you as a strange, almost elegant piece of institutional self-sufficiency, this system that manufactures its own punishment from top to bottom, and you wonder, not without a certain grim humour, whether the man who once stitched your particular jacket found himself thinking, as he worked, about the stranger who would eventually wear it. You catch sight, occasionally, of a prisoner further along in his sentence, whose uniform has softened considerably through repeated washing and wear, the harsh new stiffness long since beaten out of it by months of institutional laundering, and you find yourself looking forward, in a small, strange way, to the day your own coarse grey wool finally surrenders some of its bite. A modest, distant milestone to mark against the otherwise largely undifferentiated passage of your sentence, evidence, however small. That time is in fact still moving forward. There is, too, a strange comfort in learning the small unofficial tricks other prisoners have quietly perfected for coaxing slightly more warmth or slightly less itch out of the same government-issue wool. A discreet nod here. A shared gesture there, an entire hidden curriculum of practical survival wisdom passed silently down the gallery from prisoner to prisoner, entirely unsanctioned and entirely more useful, in its own modest way than anything printed in the official rules pinned to your cell wall. You begin, too, to notice the particular way daylight moves across the coarse weave of your sleeve during the long hours of labour, a small, unremarkable detail that would never once have caught your attention in your old life and now offers a strange, quiet form of company, proof that the world outside your narrow window continues turning steadily onward, regardless of how motionless your own circumstances currently feel. It is astonishing, you reflect, how thoroughly a person can learn to find meaning in the smallest available fragments, once every larger comfort has been so deliberately and systematically removed. Even the small ritual of folding your own blanket each morning, precisely as regulations demand, corners squared, edges aligned, becomes, over time, a modest exercise in reclaiming some fraction of control over your own immediate surroundings, a tiny domestic order you impose upon the one small patch of the world still technically, if only barely, considered your own responsibility. You find yourself performing this task with an almost ceremonial care, and you wonder, smoothing the final crease into place, whether this quiet insistence on doing at least one small thing properly, entirely for its own sake, is not itself a modest, stubborn form of the very resilience the reformers claimed to be cultivating in you all along, however differently they might have imagined it looking in practice. The door swings open onto a space that is, by any honest measurement, smaller than most modern parking spots, and you are informed, with a certain flat pride, that this will be your entire world for the foreseeable future. Pentonville-style cells, the architectural pride and joy of the separate system, measure roughly 13 feet by 7, a little under 100 square feet of stone and whitewash that must somehow accommodate a bed, a small table, a stool, a shelf, a wash basin, and a covered container serving as your toilet, all arranged with the sort of grim efficiency you would expect from men who genuinely believed that minimalism built character. High on the far wall sits a single narrow window, positioned deliberately above eye level so that you cannot see out of it even standing on your toes, allowing in a thin wash of daylight, but absolutely no view, no horizon. No passing cloud to track the hours by, nothing but a pale rectangle of sky reminding you, abstractly, that an outside world still technically exists somewhere beyond your reach. The walls are thick, load-bearing masonry, deliberately built to muffle sound almost completely, because sound, in this particular architectural philosophy, is the enemy. You run a hand along the cold stone, noting the slightly damp chill that seems to live permanently in the walls regardless of the season, and you understand with a small sinking feeling that this temperature is simply the temperature now. This is the climate of your life until further notice. The door itself is thick oak reinforced with iron, fitted with a small hinged flap at eye level that the warders use to peer in on you periodically without ever opening the door itself. An unblinking little rectangle of surveillance that you will come to both dread and strangely half welcome, because at least when that flap slides open it means another human being has briefly acknowledged your continued existence. What the cell lacks in comfort it makes up for, in relentless, almost obsessive purpose. Every element has been considered, debated, refined by committees of reformers who genuinely believed, with the confident zeal of men who had never actually had to live inside one of their own creations, that isolating a prisoner completely from human contact would force him into productive self-examination, a kind of enforced spiritual audit conducted entirely alone with nothing but your own conscience and a Bible for company. The famous separate system, championed by men like Joshua Jebb, the engineer behind Pentonville's radial design, held that criminal behaviour spread the way infection spreads, through proximity, through the corrupting chatter of hardened offenders teaching new tricks to first-timers, and that the only genuine cure was total separation, cell from cell, prisoner from prisoner, thought from any distracting outside noise. In theory, it was meant to be almost gentle, a place of quiet reflection rather than brutal punishment, an improvement on the overcrowded chaos of older prisons. In practice, spending the overwhelming majority of your waking hours locked inside 100 square feet of silence, month after month, does peculiar and often devastating things to the human mind, things the well-meaning committee members apparently fail to anticipate, despite the mounting evidence piling up in the prison's own medical reports. You will eat here. You will work here, oakum or a crank machine bolted directly into the wall depending on the week. You will sleep here, on a bed that folds up against the wall each morning to preserve what little floor space you have. You will, above all, think here, endlessly, whether you want to or not, because there is genuinely nothing else available to occupy your attention besides your own circling thoughts and the small square of visible sky reminding you daily of everything currently unavailable to you. By your second week you will know every crack in the whitewash, every subtle variation in the stone's colour, every small imperfection in the floor, the way another person might know the freckles on the back of their own hand. The cell becomes, in a strange and unwelcome way, intimately familiar, a space you could probably navigate blindfolded within a month, which is a genuinely eerie thing to realise about a room you never chose and cannot leave. The reformers called this productive solitude. The prisoners, when they were permitted to speak at all, which as you are about to discover was almost never, tended to use rather different language for it. You spend your first full evening simply cataloguing the room the way a sailor might catalogue a small boat before a long voyage, working out exactly where everything sits, exactly how many steps separate the door from the window, exactly how the single gas jet mounted in the corridor outside casts a thin, uneven wash of light through the small inspection hatch after the main lamps are dimmed for the night. You test the give of the small wooden stool, the firmness of the fold-down table, running your palm along the whitewashed stone with an attentiveness you have never previously applied to any room you have ever occupied, and you realize, somewhere in the middle of this strange private inventory, that you are doing exactly what the architects hoped you would do. Turning inward, turning meticulous, filling the vast unstructured hours with whatever small obsessive tasks your mind can manufacture simply to avoid sitting still with nothing at all to occupy it. It is, you think, a peculiar kind of intimacy to develop with a room you never chose, and you are not yet entirely sure whether you should be proud of how quickly you have made a home of it, or quietly alarmed. You find yourself, in these early days, marking the passage of the sun across your small patch of visible sky with an attentiveness previously reserved for far more important matters. Noting the particular angle of light that signals mid-morning, the slightly warmer tone that arrives around midday, the long, slow fade toward evening that tells you, more reliably than any clock, roughly how much of the day still remains ahead of you. It becomes your own private, unofficial timepiece, this small wedge of visible sky, a modest act of quiet resourcefulness in a room otherwise engineered to leave you with as little to hold on to as architecturally possible. Somewhere around your third hour inside the walls, a warder informs you, in a flat, practiced tone that suggests he has said it 1,000 times before, that you are never, under any circumstances, to speak to another prisoner. Not a greeting, not a whispered complaint about the weather, not so much as a sympathetic glance exchanged with a frightened-looking man shuffling past you in the corridor with his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, because eye contact, it turns out, counts too. The silent system, running in careful tandem with the separate system of solitary cells, was built on the same theory that got you locked in a stone box in the first place, the idea that criminal minds contaminate one another through conversation the way damp spreads through a wall, and that the only reliable cure is total, unbroken quiet enforced at every possible opportunity by men whose entire job is to notice the moment your lips so much as twitch in the wrong direction. You are marched to chapel in silence. You exercise in silence, shuffling around the yard in a great slow circle, spaced several feet apart from the prisoner ahead of you, forbidden to close the gap, forbidden to murmur, forbidden even to hum, which you discover only after absent, mindedly doing it once, and receiving a look from a nearby warder so sharp it might as well have been a slap. Meals, on the rare occasions you eat anywhere other than your own cell, are consumed without a single word passing between you and the dozens of other silent, hunched figures around you, cutlery scraping against tin the only sound in the entire echoing hall, an oddly percussive, miserable little orchestra performed nightly by several hundred men who are absolutely bursting with things they are not allowed to say. What nobody quite prepares you for is how loud the silence actually becomes after a while. Your own footsteps on stone start to sound thunderous. Your own breathing seems to fill the cell. A distant cough 2 corridors away travels through the thick walls like a cannon shot, and you find yourself straining toward it the way a starving man strains toward the smell of bread, simply because it is evidence, blessed evidence, that another human voice still technically exists somewhere in the building, even if you are forbidden from ever hearing it form actual words. Prisoners, being fundamentally social creatures who have just been informed that socializing is now a punishable offense, get remarkably creative remarkably fast. You learn, almost by instinct, to communicate through small gestures, a raised eyebrow, a particular tilt of the head, a careful cough with a rhythm to it that another prisoner 2 cells down might, if he is paying attention, recognize as a kind of greeting. Some men develop elaborate systems of tapping on pipes or walls, a crude, improvised code passed cell to cell under the noses of warders who are, admittedly, listening for exactly that sort of thing, and punish it severely whenever they catch it. It is, in a strange way, one of the few genuinely creative acts left available to you inside these walls, the desperate human impulse to connect finding some tiny crack in an otherwise airtight system, and squeezing through it regardless of the consequences. You will, in the coming weeks, become fluent in an entire silent language of glances and gestures that would be entirely useless anywhere else on earth, and yet feels, inside these walls, like the single most valuable skill you possess. The psychological toll of enforced silence, though, runs far deeper than mere inconvenience. Victorian prison doctors and chaplains, to their genuine and repeated alarm, began noting cases of what they termed prison mania, or occasionally the far more evocative term silent system madness, a condition in which prisoners subjected to prolonged isolation and enforced quiet began hallucinating, muttering incoherently to themselves, or lapsing into a kind of blank, unreachable stupor that no amount of scripture reading seemed able to cure. You have not been here long enough yet to fully appreciate the danger, but you notice it already, in small ways, the sound of your own thoughts growing strangely loud in the absence of any competing noise. Conversations you used to have with friends and family replaying themselves in your head with unsettling clarity, as though your brain, starved of actual company, has started manufacturing its own. Chaplains would later testify before parliamentary committees about prisoners who seemed to lose, quite literally, the physical capacity for ordinary speech after months of enforced quiet. Stammering and fumbling over simple sentences the way a limb atrophies from disuse. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, the realization that a system built with such careful, earnest, well-documented intentions of moral improvement could so efficiently, so thoroughly, unravel a person from the inside out, one silent hour at a time. For now, though, you simply learn the rules, quickly and without complaint, because the alternative, as you are about to discover in a rather more direct fashion, involves considerably less pleasant consequences than mere disapproval. You find yourself, in these early days of enforced quiet, developing an almost embarrassing fondness for the small, purely functional noises the institution itself makes. The scrape of a key in a distant lock, the rattle of a food trolley making its slow progress along the gallery, the muffled thud of a door closing 2 floors below, each one a tiny welcome proof that the world beyond your own 4 walls has not simply dissolved into nothing while you were not looking at it. You catch yourself straining to identify these sounds with the same intensity a starving man might apply to the smell of dinner, cataloguing them, half-consciously, into a private inventory of the prison's daily rhythm, because in the absence of conversation, in the absence of any voice raised specifically and deliberately in your direction, these small incidental noises have become, almost without your noticing the shift, the entire vocabulary of your remaining connection to a living, moving world outside your own skull. A chaplain, on one of his early rounds, remarks almost in passing that many new prisoners report this exact phenomenon, an intensified, almost hypersensitive awareness of ordinary sound, once conversation itself has been placed permanently out of reach. And you nod, unable to properly articulate just how precisely that small observation captures the strange, hollow, listening quality your days have already begun to take on. You begin, too, to notice the particular etiquette that governs even the most minimal permitted verbal exchanges, warders and prisoners alike speaking in short, clipped, entirely functional sentences stripped of anything resembling ordinary pleasantry, the sort of institutional shorthand that would sound almost comically brusque anywhere else in the world, and here simply passes as the only acceptable register of speech remaining available to anyone within these walls. You find yourself, on the rare occasions a warder addresses you directly, unconsciously matching that same clipped economy in your own reply, one more small way the institution's rhythm has begun quietly reshaping even the parts of you that technically still retain the freedom to speak. By the time the light through your high, unreachable window finally begins to fade, you are exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical labour and everything to do with the sheer effort of holding yourself together in total isolation for an entire day, and you turn with something almost like relief to the narrow wooden shelf hinged against the wall that passes, in this establishment, for a bed. It is, to describe it generously, a plank. A literal, flat, unforgiving plank of wood, hinged so that it can be folded up against the wall each morning to preserve precious floor space, fitted with a thin straw-filled mattress that has clearly seen better decades, and a couple of coarse woolen blankets that smell faintly of carbolic soap and several dozen previous occupants. Early in the history of the separate system, some prisons dispensed with any mattress at all, for at least the first portion of a sentence, on the theory, apparently sincerely held, that physical discomfort at night sharpened the moral faculties and discouraged idleness, an idea that suggests its architects had perhaps never personally attempted to sleep on bare wood after a full day of picking. Oakum. You lie down carefully, testing the give of the thin mattress, which offers roughly the cushioning of a folded newspaper, and you feel every single contour of the wood beneath it pressing into your shoulder blades, your hips, the base of your spine, in a way that makes rolling over feel less like a small nighttime adjustment and more like a full tactical manoeuvre. The cell, having spent all day absorbing the chill of the surrounding stone, seems somehow even colder now that the sun has gone, and you huddle beneath the thin blankets doing the same mental arithmetic every prisoner before you has done, calculating precisely how many degrees of warmth you can reasonably expect to generate purely through the act of shivering. Sleep itself proves to be a slippery, uncooperative thing. It is not merely the discomfort of the plank, though that alone would be enough to keep most reasonable people awake well past midnight, rearranging themselves in a doomed search for a position that does not press directly against bone. It is the sounds, too, the strange chorus that a prison makes after dark. Distant footsteps of a night patrol warder moving along the gallery at irregular intervals, checking through the little hinged flap in each door to confirm you are still exactly where you are supposed to be. The occasional muffled cough or shifting weight from a neighbouring cell carrying faintly through the thick stone walls, and beneath it all, your own mind. Freshly starved of conversation and stimulation for 16 straight hours, running in tight, anxious circles about the months and years still stretching ahead of you. Insomnia, unsurprisingly, was rampant among Victorian prisoners, and prison medical officers recorded it constantly in their reports, alongside a whole catalogue of related complaints, chronic fatigue, irritability, and a certain hollow-eyed look that warders apparently learn to recognise on new arrivals within their first month. You try, as instructed by absolutely nobody but attempted anyway out of sheer desperation, to slow your breathing, to count something, anything, to trick your body into believing that rest is possible on a surface this punishing. Some nights it works. Eventually, somewhere well past the point you stopped consciously trying. Other nights you simply lie there through the small hours, staring at the faint grey rectangle of your window, listening to the prison breathe around you in its strange, muffled, institutional way, and wondering, not for the last time, how something as basic and universal as sleep could have been engineered into yet another daily struggle. Morning, when it finally arrives, brings with it the distant clang of a bell that you will, by the end of your sentence, be able to recognise blindfolded, and the plank bed folds obediently back up against the wall, tucking away the evidence of your rough night as though it never happened, ready to be lowered again some 14 or so hours later for another identical round. There is something almost mockingly efficient about it, the way the bed itself seems designed not for your comfort, but simply for the tidy management of space. One more small object in your cell engineered around institutional logic rather than human need. You rise stiff, achy, and not remotely rested, rub feeling back into a shoulder that has spent the night pressed against solid wood, and reflect with the particular dark humour that seems to develop naturally in a place like this, that at home you used to complain about your mattress being slightly too firm. You would very much like to formally apologise to that mattress now, wherever it currently is, presumably still comfortably supporting somebody else's unbroken night's sleep. You develop, over the following weeks, a whole private repertoire of small nighttime rituals aimed at coaxing your battered body towards something resembling rest, folding the thin blanket into a makeshift pillow beneath your aching shoulder, shifting your weight in careful, practiced stages, designed to distribute the plank's unforgiving pressure across as much surface area as possible. Timing your breathing to some half-remembered lullaby your mother once hummed. Though you are careful never to hum it aloud, mindful of the silent system's reach even into the supposed privacy of your own bedtime. Other prisoners, you gather through the same careful whispered grapevine that carries every scrap of unofficial information through these walls, have developed their own elaborate strategies, some swearing by sleeping with their boots still loosely laced for warmth, others insisting that lying with your feet toward the door rather than the window makes some meaningful difference against the draught. Small folk remedies passed cell to cell with the earnest conviction of men who have precious little else to hold on to besides the belief that they have found some tiny personal advantage against a system otherwise entirely indifferent to their comfort. You try a few of these tricks yourself, with mixed results, and you come, eventually, to a grudging peace with the plank. Not because it ever becomes comfortable, but because your body, remarkable and stubborn thing that it is, slowly begins finding its own accommodations with even the most punishing of circumstances, given sufficient repetition and no other available alternative. You think some nights of your old bed, the one you complained about so freely and so foolishly before all of this began, and you construct, in loving detail, an entire imaginary catalogue of its virtues. The particular give of the mattress, the weight of a proper quilt, the sheer unremarkable luxury of simply rolling over without every muscle in your back registering a formal complaint. It is a strange kind of grief, mourning a mattress, and yet here you are, doing exactly that, night after night, on a plank that has taught you, more thoroughly than any sermon ever could, precisely how much of what you once considered merely adequate was in fact a quiet and unappreciated luxury all along. Before you have even opened your eyes properly, a bell somewhere deep in the building begins to toll, loud, insistent, and entirely uninterested in whether you are in the middle of a dream. This is the sound that will structure every single day of your sentence from this point forward, ringing out at fixed intervals to mark rising, washing, chapel, labour, meals, exercise, and lights out, a rigid timetable observed with the sort of punctuality that would put most modern train companies to shame. Victorian prison reformers were, if nothing else, deeply enthusiastic about the disciplinary power of routine, believing that an unbroken, predictable schedule applied with total consistency day after day, year after year, would instill in the criminal mind the kind of order and self-control it had so obviously lacked on the outside. You rise the instant the bell sounds because you learn within your first morning exactly what happens to prisoners who do not, a sharp reprimand at best, a formal note in your conduct record at worst, and conduct records, you are quickly given to understand, follow you around like a shadow for the entire length of your sentence, quietly determining things like whether you might eventually earn slightly better rations or a slightly earlier release through the mark system some prisons were beginning to experiment with. You fold your plank bed against the wall, splash cold water on your face from the small tin basin, and stand ready at your cell door, because the bell does not wait, has never waited, and shows no sign of intending to start now. The timetable itself, once you become familiar with it, reveals a strange sort of grim comfort buried inside its rigidity. There is, at the very least, no ambiguity. You know, down to the quarter hour, precisely what is required of you at every moment of the day, a level of certainty that, oddly enough, some prisoners come to find almost soothing after the chaos and desperation of whatever circumstances landed them here in the first place. Rise at 6. Wash and dress by past. chapel or cell prayers shortly after. Breakfast delivered through the small hatch in your door precisely on schedule. Labour, whether that means the crank, the treadwheel, or a pile of old rope waiting to be picked apart fibre by fibre, begins promptly and continues with only the briefest of interruptions for the bulk of the day. Exercise, weather permitting, occupies a narrow window in the early afternoon. Supper arrives in the evening, followed by a further stretch of solitary labour or scripture reading in your cell, and finally, mercifully, the bell for lights out, after which the gas lamp outside your cell is dimmed, and you are left alone with the plank bed and your own thoughts until the entire cycle begins again, roughly 12 hours later. It is, in its own bleak way, almost soothing in its total predictability, the way a metronome is soothing even while it relentlessly mechanically marks time you would rather not be spending in a cell at all. What the bell truly represents, though, once you sit with it long enough, is the complete surrender of your own internal clock to an external authority. Out in the world, you woke when your body told you to, ate when hunger struck, rested when tired. Here, every single one of those basic biological rhythms has been quietly confiscated and replaced with an institutional schedule that answers to nobody's actual needs but the prison's own administrative convenience. You stop within a matter of weeks, trusting your own sense of time entirely, relying instead on the bell to tell you when you are hungry, when you are tired, when you are permitted to move, and when you must remain perfectly still. Some prisoners later described, once released, a strange disorientation upon returning to a world without bells, finding themselves waking automatically at odd hours out of pure institutional habit, or feeling a peculiar, nagging anxiety at midday when no chime arrived to tell them what to do next. The bell, more than the walls, more than the silence, more than the itchy grey wool of your uniform, is perhaps the single most effective tool in the entire system for reshaping a person from the inside. Not through cruelty exactly, but through the relentless, patient erosion of your own capacity to simply decide things for yourself. You notice, somewhere around your 6th or 7th week, a peculiar new habit taking root, an involuntary flinch of anticipation in the seconds just before each bell actually sounds. Your body somehow learning to predict the schedule with a precision your conscious mind never consciously memorized. The way a dog begins salivating at the sound of a cupboard door long before it has any rational understanding of what dinner actually is. This unsettles you rather more than you expect it to. This evidence that some deeper, more animal layer of your own nervous system has quietly absorbed the institution's rhythm and made it entirely its own, without so much as consulting the rest of you first. You wonder, lying awake in the last few minutes before the final bell of the evening, what it will feel like to live again without this particular rigid architecture governing every transition of your day, whether your body will simply forget the bell's rhythm the moment you walk free, or whether, as you rather suspect, it will linger for months or years afterward, an invisible metronome ticking on somewhere beneath your ordinary waking thoughts long after the actual sound itself has become nothing more than a distant, unpleasant memory. You find a certain grim comedy, when you allow yourself to notice it, in the fact that an entire nation once prided itself on inventing increasingly precise mechanical clocks, chronometers accurate enough to guide ships safely across oceans, while simultaneously deciding that the single most effective tool for reforming a criminal soul was a large bell rung at fixed intervals by a man who has never once asked you whether the schedule actually suits you. Progress, you reflect, watching the thin light shift by degrees across your cell wall between one bell and the next, appears to move in some directions rather more generously than others. Through the small hinged hatch in your cell door slides a tin bowl of something greyish, watery, and faintly warm, and a warder's voice on the other side informs you, without much enthusiasm, that this is breakfast. The dish in question is skilly, sometimes called styrobout, a thin gruel made primarily from oatmeal boiled in water, occasionally thickened if you are fortunate, with a little extra meal, and seasoned with essentially nothing at all, because seasoning, like most small pleasures, has been deemed unnecessary for the purposes of moral reform. Alongside it sits a small ration of bread, dense, coarse, and weighed out to the precise ounce by a system of dietary scales drawn up by prison medical officers with the same rigorous, joyless attention to detail they might apply to feeding livestock, which is not entirely a coincidental comparison. Since Victorian prison diets were quite literally calculated using formulas borrowed from agricultural science, balancing the minimum caloric input required to keep a labouring body functional against the institutional desire to avoid anything resembling comfort or indulgence. You eat slowly, partly because the gruel is not especially appetizing, and partly because, in the total silence of your cell, there is genuinely nothing else to occupy the next 15 minutes besides the exact business of chewing, an activity that under normal circumstances you would never have considered a form of entertainment, and yet here, in the absence of literally anything else, becomes something close to it. The precision behind your rations deserves a moment of appreciation in the darkest possible sense of that word. Prison dietary tables, revised and argued over extensively by committees throughout the middle of the century, specified exact quantities down to the ounce for every category of prisoner, adjusted by the length and severity of your sentence and the nature of your labour. On the theory that a man breaking stones needed marginally more sustenance than a man merely picking oakum, and that neither of them needed anything resembling actual pleasure from the process of eating, meat appeared on the weekly schedule sparingly, sometimes not at all for certain classes of shorter-term prisoners, and when it did arrive it came in portions so modest that prisoners frequently reported dreaming about food with an intensity that bordered on the religious. Cheese, when included, was doled out in slivers. Potatoes, when available, were boiled without so much as a suggestion of butter. The entire philosophy behind Victorian prison catering rested on a single guiding principle known as less eligibility, the deliberate official insistence that conditions inside prison must never, under any circumstances, be allowed to seem more comfortable or better provisioned than the conditions endured by the very poorest honest labourer outside the walls, lest the prospect of a warm bowl of gruel and a dry bed start looking suspiciously appealing to a starving but law-abiding citizen. It is, when you think about it for more than a few seconds, a genuinely bizarre policy to build an entire national dietary system around, essentially competing with poverty itself to see which one can be marginally more miserable. But there it is, spooned out into your tin bowl every single morning with the same grim consistency. You finish the bowl quickly, scraping the last watery traces from the sides with your spoon, in a manner you would have found faintly undignified only a week earlier, and now perform without a second thought. And you set the empty tin by the hatch for later collection, already, astonishingly, thinking ahead to the next meal, because meals, however unremarkable, have rapidly become the primary punctuation marks of your entire existence, small islands of sensation in an otherwise featureless sea of silence and stone. Hunger, mild but constant, becomes a familiar background companion, never quite severe enough to be classified as starvation by the careful calculations of the prison's medical officers, yet never once fully satisfied either, a low-grade gnawing presence that follows you through your labour and your chapel attendance and your restless nights on the plank bed. Prisoners who served longer sentences later testified, when parliamentary committees eventually got around to investigating conditions, of a persistent preoccupation with food that bordered on obsession, elaborate imagined meals constructed in idle moments. Recipes recalled from childhood turned over lovingly in the mind like cherished photographs. It is a strange kind of hunger, this one, not sharp enough to be an emergency, simply steady enough to remind you, 3 times daily, in a thin grey bowl slid silently through a hatch, exactly how carefully your suffering has been measured, weighed, and portioned out by people who never once had to eat it themselves. You find yourself in idle moments during your labour, reconstructing entire remembered meals in obsessive, loving detail. The particular way your mother browned an onion, the exact texture of a proper Sunday joint, the sharp, forgotten pleasure of salt actually applied deliberately to food rather than withheld as a matter of institutional policy. And you understand, somewhat sheepishly, that you have become one of those men the prison surgeon's reports describe with a certain clinical detachment, a prisoner whose thoughts drift toward food with a frequency that borders on the compulsive. Occasionally, on days when the kitchen supply runs slightly more generous than the official dietary table strictly requires, a marginally thicker ladle of gruel, an extra crust of bread tucked in alongside your ration, you experience a small, genuine surge of something close to joy, disproportionate, faintly embarrassing joy, over a quantity of food that would have barely registered as a snack in your old life. And you reflect, chewing slowly to make it last, that this too is precisely the kind of quiet. In voluntary recalibration, the system has been patiently working on you since the moment you first walked through that gate, teaching your body and your expectations both to be grateful for considerably less than either of them once considered adequate. You learn, too, the particular skill of eating slowly enough to stretch the sensation of a meal across as many minutes as possible, chewing each modest mouthful with an attentiveness that would have struck your old self as faintly ridiculous, and you find that this small, deliberate slowness offers, if nothing else, the illusion of a slightly larger portion than the bowl actually contains. A modest trick of the mind that costs the institution nothing, and yet somehow makes the whole grim ritual marginally more bearable, 3 times a day, every day, for as long as your sentence continues to run. At 9:30, a warder unlocks your cell, marches you down a series of echoing corridors, and delivers you to a long, low shed containing what looks, at first glance, like an enormous wooden water wheel that has taken a catastrophically wrong turn somewhere and ended up indoors. This is the treadwheel, or treadmill as it was more commonly known, and you are about to spend the better part of the next 6 hours climbing it, a punishment so deceptively simple in concept and so genuinely brutal in practice that it became, over the course of the 19th century, one of the single most iconic and dreaded features of British prison life. The wheel itself consists of a great cylinder fitted with a series of wooden steps around its circumference, divided lengthwise into individual compartments so that you and perhaps 20 or more fellow prisoners can each occupy your own separate section, gripping a wooden handrail in front of you, and step onto the ever-descending stairs beneath your feet. Your combined weight and motion turning the whole mechanism steadily forward. It is, in essence, an enormous human-powered escalator that goes nowhere forever, and the sheer relentless repetition of it is precisely the point. Invented by an engineer named William Cubitt in 1818, specifically because he was troubled by the sight of idle prisoners lounging about with nothing productive to occupy their hands, the treadwheel was designed to convert wasted criminal energy into either genuinely useful mechanical work, grinding corn or pumping water for the prison, or, in a great many institutions, into nothing at all beyond pure deliberate exertion, power generated and then simply discarded, the prison equivalent of digging a hole only to fill it back in again. Your legs discover, somewhere around the 20-minute mark, muscles you did not previously know you possessed, and those muscles discover, in turn, that they deeply resent this new arrangement. The stepping motion itself is not complicated. Lift, step, shift your weight. Lift, step, shift your weight. Over and over in an unbroken rhythm dictated by the turning of the wheel beneath you rather than by any pace of your own choosing, because falling behind means being dragged awkwardly by the descending steps while the prisoners on either side of you continue their own steady climb, regardless. The regulations governing the wheel specified precise quotas, so many thousand feet of vertical ascent per day depending on the severity of your sentence, calculated by prison engineers with the same cheerful arithmetic precision applied to your dietary rations, translating what amounts to genuine, punishing physical labour into a tidy column of numbers in an official ledger somewhere. Sweat soaks through your itchy grey uniform within the first half hour despite the persistent damp chill of the shed, and your breath comes in ragged, laboured gasps that you are naturally forbidden from voicing as complaint, because complaint, like conversation, remains firmly against the rules even while your thighs are actively screaming their objections. Warders posted around the wheel watch closely for anyone attempting to ease their effort by leaning too heavily on the handrail or shortening their steps. Corrections issued swiftly and without much patience for excuses about exhaustion. Because exhaustion, from the institutional perspective, is rather the entire point of the exercise. The genuinely maddening part, the detail that seems to unsettle every new arrival more than the physical strain itself, is the total deliberate pointlessness of it in most establishments. Some prisons connected their wheels to actual millstones, grinding flour that fed the very prisoners producing it, lending at least a shred of practical logic to the misery. Many others, however, particularly by the later decades of the century, deliberately disconnected the mechanism from any productive task at all, fitting it instead with a simple fan or resistance brake, whose only function was to provide something for the wheel to push against, converting hours of genuine human exertion into precisely nothing. A philosophy prison reformers defended with entirely straight faces as being about discipline and habit formation rather than results. You climb and climb and climb, thousands upon thousands of individual steps mounting up over the course of the day into a number so large it would be genuinely impressive if it produced literally anything of value. And by the time the bell finally releases you back to your cell in the late afternoon, your legs trembling, your lower back aching in a dull persistent throb, you understand with total clarity that you have just spent 6 hours essentially climbing a very tall, entirely imaginary mountain that led nowhere whatsoever, purely because someone decided, with genuine institutional confidence, that this particular flavour of pointless suffering would improve your character. Your character, for what it is worth, currently feels mostly just tired. You notice, watching the other prisoners occupying the neighbouring compartments of the great wheel, a whole silent language of shared, unspoken misery passing between men who are otherwise forbidden from acknowledging each other's existence in any direct way. A particular sideways glance exchanged at the top of a punishing hour. A small, involuntary grimace mirrored almost simultaneously across half a dozen straining faces as the wheel's pace momentarily quickens beyond comfortable rhythm. It occurs to you that the treadwheel, whatever else its inventor intended, has accidentally created one of the very few spaces within this entire institution where something resembling genuine collective experience still manages to survive. 20 or more men bound together, however briefly and however wordlessly, by the identical, grinding, pointless labour beneath their feet. You think somewhat bitterly of William Cubitt, the engineer who dreamed this contraption up out of concern for idle prisoners, and you find yourself wondering whether he ever once imagined the particular specific ache that settles into a man's lower back by the 4th consecutive hour, or whether idleness from where he sat simply looked like a problem best solved on paper, far away from any actual wheel, any actual straining leg, any actual prisoner counting down the endless remaining steps toward a summit that will never, under any circumstances, actually arrive. You notice, too, the strange dignity some prisoners manage to bring even to this most degrading of tasks, back straight, pace steady, refusing to let the sheer pointlessness of the exercise show visibly on their faces, a small private rebellion conducted entirely through posture, since every other avenue of protest remains firmly closed to them. You find yourself, somewhere around your 3rd week of regular wheel duty, adopting the same quiet discipline yourself. climbing your allotted thousands of feet with a straight back and a carefully blank expression. Not because you have come to believe in the exercise's supposed moral value, but simply because refusing to let it visibly break you has become, in its own small way, the only victory currently available to you. On alternate days, or sometimes as a punishment for insufficient enthusiasm on the treadwheel, you are returned to your cell to find a curious iron contraption already bolted to the wall, a simple handle projecting from a box mounted at roughly waist height, and you are informed that your labour quota for today involves turning it a very, very large number of times. The crank machine, sometimes nicknamed the shin scraper by prisoners for reasons that become apparent within the first 10 minutes of acquaintance, is a masterpiece of purposeful nothing. Inside the sealed iron box sits a paddle wheel or a set of cups rotating through a chamber of sand or gravel, and turning the external handle simply drags that paddle through resistance, over and over, producing no flour, no rope, no useful output of any kind beyond the numbers ticking upward on a small dial attached to the top of the box. A dial the warder checks periodically to confirm you have hit your quota rather than simply standing beside it looking industrious. Some regimes demanded as many as 10,000 revolutions in a single day from prisoners sentenced to hard labour, a figure that sounds almost comically abstract until you actually begin turning the handle yourself and discover just how quickly a simple rotating motion transforms from mildly tedious into a genuine, searing burn radiating up through your forearm, your shoulder, and eventually your entire upper back. The warders, delightfully, held the power to adjust the resistance inside the box by tightening a screw, meaning a prisoner who had displeased his overseers in some small way, a muttered word, a slow mourning, an insufficiently respectful expression, might find his crank suddenly and silently made considerably harder to turn. The punishment invisible to anyone but the man straining against it. A quietly sadistic little flourish, buried in an otherwise entirely mechanical system. You settle into a rhythm within the first hour, counting under your breath, though even counting, strictly speaking, edges uncomfortably close to the forbidden category of speech, and you learn quickly to keep the numbers silent, tracked instead by a private, wordless tally in your head that blurs, somewhere past the first 1,000, into something closer to meditation than mathematics. Your palm blisters against the wooden handle by mid-morning, a raw, stinging patch that you switch hands to avoid, only to discover your other palm has precisely the same objection within another hour or so. The genuinely maddening element, familiar now from your recent acquaintance with the treadwheel, is the crank's total, deliberate absence of purpose. At least oakum, however miserable to pick, eventually became naval rope caulking. At least the treadwheel occasionally ground actual corn. The crank produces literally nothing, ever by design, its entire output measured purely in revolutions logged against your prisoner number in yet another ledger somewhere, a number that exists solely to prove you spent the requisite hours suffering in an appropriately industrious-looking manner. Reformers defended the crank. When pressed by the occasional visiting journalist or parliamentary inspector, using the same vocabulary they applied to everything else in the system, discipline, habit, moral improvement through structured exertion, though it is difficult, sitting alone in a cell turning an iron handle toward no destination whatsoever for the 4th consecutive hour. To feel much of that supposed moral improvement taking hold anywhere within you besides your steadily worsening blisters. By the time the bell finally releases you from your quota, your arm trembles with a particular deep involuntary shake of a muscle that has been asked to repeat the same small motion many thousands of times without rest, and you find yourself unable to fully straighten your fingers for a good 10 minutes afterward, curled instead into the loose claw shape they held around the handle for the better part of the day. Prison surgeons noted, with a certain detached clinical interest, cases of prisoners developing chronic shoulder and wrist complaints from prolonged crank labour alongside a persistent, Low-grade despair that seemed to settle particularly heavily over men assigned this specific task rather than any of the prison's other available forms of purposeless suffering. There is something uniquely demoralizing, it turns out, about labour with no product, no goal, no destination beyond the number itself. A lesson that Victorian reformers stumbled into almost by accident while attempting to engineer discipline through repetition and instead engineered, in a great many cases, something closer to quiet despair. You return your aching hands to your lap as the warder locks the cell door behind him, and you spend the remaining hour before supper simply staring at the small iron box bolted to your wall, wondering, with the particular exhausted clarity that follows real physical strain, whether anyone involved in designing this machine ever once considered turning the handle themselves before deciding it. Would build anybody's character. You learn over the following weeks to recognize the subtle click and shift of the mechanism inside the box as the sand or gravel paddle wheel resists in slightly varying degrees, developing an almost musician's ear for the particular rhythm of your own machine, whether today's crank has been left at its ordinary setting, or whether, following some minor infraction you may not even have been fully aware of committing, a warder has quietly tightened the resistance screw overnight. It becomes, in its own bleak way, a kind of diagnostic tool, this careful attention to the crank's precise feel, offering you small, unreliable clues about your own current standing within the institution's invisible, ever-shifting ledger of approval and disapproval, one more skill you never asked to acquire and now cannot quite imagine functioning without. You wonder occasionally about the men who manufactured this particular iron box, whether they took any satisfaction in their craftsmanship, whether they ever paused, fitting the internal paddle wheel into place, to consider the thousands of anonymous hands that would eventually strain against the handle they were building, or whether the whole contraption was simply another commission, measured, priced, and delivered with no more sentiment than a length of drainpipe. There is something quietly unsettling about that possibility, the idea that your daily suffering was assembled, quite literally, on an ordinary factory floor by ordinary tradesmen thinking about their own dinner and their own aching backs, entirely unaware that their finished product would one day occupy so much space in the private thoughts of a stranger they would never meet. Some mornings, instead of the crank or the wheel, a warder deposits a heavy, tarry, foul-smelling bundle of old ship's rope onto the small table in your cell, along with a tin plate to catch the fibres, and tells you your task for the day is to pick it entirely apart with your bare hands. Oakum picking. One of the oldest and most widespread forms of prison labour in Victorian England, involves untwisting old weathered tar-soaked rope, much of it salvaged from decommissioned naval vessels, back down into its original loose hemp fibres, which shipbuilders then mixed with tar and used to caulk the seams of wooden ships, packing them watertight against the sea. Its sounds described this plainly, almost restful, a bit of quiet handwork not unlike unpicking an old jumper. And for approximately the first 20 minutes it genuinely is exactly that, a task simple enough to perform in total silence without drawing a warder's attention, your fingers working methodically at the stiff blackened strands while your mind wanders wherever it likes, which, given your current circumstances, is usually somewhere considerably more pleasant than the cell you are currently sitting in. The trouble begins shortly afterward, once the tar, ancient and thoroughly hardened by years of exposure to salt water and sun, begins to resist your fingernails, and the rope itself, twisted tight decades ago by sailors with entirely different priorities than your future comfort, refuses to yield without a genuine fight. You dig your thumbnail into the fibres, working at a stubborn knot, and feel the skin beneath it split. A small sharp sting that you barely register the first time, and will come to know with grim familiarity by the end of your first week. Prison quotas for oakum varied by institution, and by the severity of your sentence. But even the more modest daily requirements, often somewhere between 1 and 3 pounds of picked fibre, demand hours of continuous, repetitive strain on fingers never remotely designed for this particular abuse. Your fingertips, soft from whatever trade you practiced before your conviction, unless you happen to have arrived here already a sailor or a rope maker with appropriately calloused hands, crack and split within days, the tar working its way into every fresh wound and stinging with a persistent, low-grade fire that never quite fades before the next day's quota begins. Some prisoners wrapped their fingers in scraps of cloth when warders were not watching closely, a small forbidden mercy that risked punishment if discovered, since any deviation from the standard method, any attempt to ease the labour's design purpose, tended to be treated as evidence of insufficient application to your reform. The smell, thick, tarry, faintly reminiscent of a ship's hold, seeps into your clothes, your hair, the very stone of your cell walls, until you can no longer entirely separate the scent of oakum from the general atmosphere of imprisonment itself, the two having merged. Somewhere around your second week, into a single inseparable olfactory memory that some former prisoners reported catching whiffs of decades later, apparently at the most unexpected and unwelcome moments. The genuine irony buried inside the whole enterprise, the detail that would have made you laugh out loud if laughing were not itself a punishable breach of the silent system, is that oakum picking was, unlike the crank or the treadwheel, actually useful. The finished fibre sold on to naval contractors and shipbuilders, generating real income for the prison and performing real necessary maritime work. Somewhere out on the open sea, an actual ship's hull was staying watertight, thanks directly to the raw bleeding labour of men locked in cells picking apart old rope one stubborn strand at a time, a fact that should perhaps have offered some small comfort about contributing usefully to society, and instead mostly just added a bitter edge to the whole exercise, since none of that usefulness translated into so much as a slightly softer mattress or a marginally larger bread ration for the men actually producing it. You work through your quota steadily, pausing periodically to flex fingers that have begun to stiffen into an awkward permanent curl, glancing occasionally at the small growing pile of loose fibre accumulating on your tin plate, a modest daily monument to hours of genuine physical suffering that will, within the week, be swept up, weighed, bundled and shipped off to some distant dockyard, never to be thought of again by anyone except, perhaps, you, on the nights your fingers ache too badly to properly fall asleep. By the end of your first month of regular oakum duty, your hands have developed a rough, calloused resilience that would have seemed impossible on your first tar-stained morning. The skin thickened and toughened in a manner not entirely unlike the transformation the prison itself hopes to work on the rest of you, hardened, weathered, gradually reshaped by repeated exposure to something abrasive, until the discomfort no longer registers quite as sharply as it once did. Whether that particular kind of hardening constitutes moral improvement, as the system's architects so earnestly believed, or simply the numb, practical adaptation of a body left with no other option, is a question you find yourself pondering more than once during the long silent hours spent picking apart yet another bundle of old, tarry, thoroughly uncooperative rope. You begin, after a few weeks of steady practice, to notice small variations in the rope itself, older strands crumbling apart almost gratefully under your fingers, others clearly salvaged from some vessel that weathered a genuinely brutal voyage, twisted so tight and hardened so thoroughly by salt and sun that working them loose feels less like picking and more like negotiating. You find a strange private satisfaction in these small distinctions, the closest thing available to variety or novelty within an otherwise entirely repetitive task, and you catch yourself, on occasion, almost enjoying the particular puzzle of a stubborn knot, a fleeting, guilty pleasure you would never have expected to feel about manual labour performed under duress in a silent stone cell. Other prisoners, you learn, develop their own quiet specialities and preferences within the oakum shed, some requesting, through whatever limited channels of communication remain available to them, the tougher tarred rope over the more brittle white rope, finding the greater resistance somehow more satisfying to work through than rope that crumbles apart too easily and leaves the hours stretching, emptier than ever. The quota itself, tallied carefully at the end of each day by a warder who weighs your finished pile of loose fibre on a small brass scale kept specifically for this purpose, becomes a source of genuine, if entirely private, pride once you have been at the task long enough to consistently exceed the minimum requirement. You find yourself, somewhat to your own surprise, taking real satisfaction in watching the needle of that scale swing past the mark, a small measurable achievement in a life that otherwise offers you virtually no opportunity to measure your own progress against anything at all. It is a peculiar thing, discovering that even inside a system explicitly designed to strip away your sense of individual accomplishment, some stubborn instinct toward competence and pride in a job well done manages to survive regardless, quietly asserting itself in the unlikeliest possible setting, over a pile of old tarred rope that nobody outside these walls will ever know or care was picked, apart by your particular pair of increasingly calloused hands. On days when your labour assignment shifts away from rope and toward canvas, you find yourself hunched over a length of coarse sacking material, a heavy needle and a spool of thick waxed thread, tasked with stitching together the mailbags that will, once inspected and approved, carry the country's post from town to town in service of Her Majesty's General Post Office. The work, at first glance, seems almost a relief after the raw-fingered misery of oakum, requiring a finer, more delicate coordination rather than sheer brute persistence, and for a prisoner with any prior tailoring or shoemaking background, it can even feel, in its strange way, like a distant, diminished echo of an honest trade rather than a purely punitive exercise. The needle is thick and stubborn, designed for heavy canvas rather than delicate fabric, and pushing it through several layers of tightly woven sacking demands a surprising amount of hand strength, particularly once you are several hours and several dozen stitches into your daily quota, your fingertips developing their own set of small stinging punctures to keep the oakum scars company. Mistakes are noted and corrected without much patience, a crooked seam or an uneven stitch spacing earning a sharp word from the inspecting warder, and, on occasion, the tedious requirement to unpick your own faulty work and redo it properly, a small but genuinely demoralizing taste of labour undone entirely by your own error, in a life that already offers precious few opportunities to feel any sense of accomplishment whatsoever. Alongside mailbag stitching, many institutions set prisoners to work picking coir, the tough, bristly fibre stripped from coconut husks and imported in vast quantities for use in doormats, brushes, and rough matting, a task that shares much of oakum's punishing texture without quite matching its tar-soaked misery. Coir fibre is stiff, sharp-edged, and prone to working its way beneath your fingernails in tiny irritating splinters that you spend your evenings picking back out again by the thin light filtering through your cell window. A strange little bonus round of manual labour that nobody officially assigned you, but that your own discomfort insists upon regardless. The rhythm of the work, hour after hour of separating stubborn fibre from stubborn fibre, settles into the same trance-like repetition you have already grown familiar with from your other labour assignments, your hands moving almost independently of conscious thought while your mind drifts, inevitably toward home, toward whatever combination of circumstances and choices delivered you to this particular cell, toward the calendar you keep count of scratched carefully into the underside of your small shelf, marking off each completed day with the quiet, private satisfaction of a man counting down toward something, even if that something remains agonizingly far away. The broader purpose behind this entire category of prison labour, mailbags, mats, coarse cloth, and the like was never particularly disguised or subtle. Victorian prisons operated in no small part as functioning industrial workshops, their unpaid captive workforce producing genuine goods sold into the wider economy at rates that undercut quite significantly. Any honest tradesman attempting to compete for the same government contracts using paid labour, petitions and complaints from outside manufacturers, aggrieved at losing business to prison workshops that paid their workforce nothing beyond a bowl of skilly and a plank bed, surfaced periodically throughout the century a genuinely strange historical footnote in which the moral reformation of criminals became entangled with straightforward, unglamorous commercial competition. You, hunched over your needle and thread, are not merely serving a sentence. You are, quite literally, manufacturing product, your labour quietly subsidising the very institution currently keeping you locked away from everyone and everything you have ever known. An arrangement that would strike most outside observers as a fairly transparent conflict of interest, and that strikes you. Somewhere around your 200th completed stitch of the afternoon, as simply one more small, unglamorous indignity layered on top of all the others. By the time the light fails and the bell calls an end to your labour for the day, you set aside your needle with fingers cramped into a shape not unlike the claw the crank leaves behind, and you inspect your completed mailbags with something that, despite everything, resembles a flicker of quiet pride, imperfect, imprisoned pride, but pride nonetheless, at a row of even sturdy stitches that will, within the week, be carrying someone else's letters across the length of the country, entirely unaware of the silent, aching hands that stitched together their journey. You think, occasionally, about the strange journey your own finished mailbags will take once they leave the prison workshop, imagining them slung over the shoulder of some cheerful postman in a town you have never visited, carrying birthday letters and business correspondence and love notes between people who will never once pause to wonder who actually sewed the sturdy canvas sack now delivering. Their post, and there is something almost wistful in that anonymous, invisible connection to the ordinary world outside, a small thread of usefulness stretching out from your cell into the lives of total strangers who will benefit from your labour without ever knowing your name or your number or the particular circumstances that landed you here in the first place. The choir work, by contrast, offers no such comforting fantasy, since a doormat, however sturdily constructed, rarely inspires the same imaginative journey as a mailbag carrying someone's cherished correspondence, and you find the hours spent separating stiff, splintering Phoebe considerably harder to endure, without at least some small story to tell yourself about where your labour is ultimately headed. The post office contract itself, you learn through occasional fragments of conversation overheard from warders discussing prison business within your hearing, represented a significant and genuinely lucrative arrangement for institutions able to secure it. Prison workshops competing quietly against one another for the privilege of supplying the government's mailbag requirements, a fact that adds a rather uncomfortable commercial dimension to the whole enterprise once you sit with it for more than a few minutes. You are, in the most literal sense, an unpaid industrial workforce, generating real revenue for an institution that provides you in exchange with a plank bed, a bowl of thin gruel, and the occasional stinging lecture about the moral virtues of honest labour. An arrangement that strikes you, hunched over your needle with fingers cramped from hours of repetitive stitching, as containing rather less honest reciprocity than the sermons would have you believe. Once a day, weather and behaviour permitting, a warder unlocks your cell and marches you out into a large, high-walled yard for the single period of your entire schedule officially designated for fresh air. And it is here, blinking in the comparatively enormous open sky, that you first encounter one of the separate system's most genuinely unsettling inventions. Fitted over your head, or in some establishments simply enforced through the deep peaked caps you already wear pulled low, is a device intended to prevent you from recognising, or being recognised, by any of the dozens of fellow prisoners now shuffling around the yard alongside you in the same enormous, slow-moving circle. Early versions of the separate system employed actual cloth or leather masks with small eye holes, giving the entire exercise yard the disorienting, faintly nightmarish appearance of several dozen anonymous figures processing silently around a stone enclosure, each one utterly unable to identify the person walking only a few feet ahead or behind. Later, many prisons abandoned the literal masks in favour of the deep-peaked caps alone, worn tilted forward to obscure the face from anyone approaching from the side or behind, achieving much the same effect through slightly less theatrical means. You are positioned at a fixed, carefully maintained distance behind the prisoner ahead of you, forbidden to close the gap, forbidden to speak, forbidden even to turn your head to glance sideways at the men shuffling along the parallel rings, sometimes arranged concentrically within larger yards, and you walk, and walk, and walk, in a great slow circle that leads, of course, precisely nowhere, covering perhaps a mile or more of ground over the course of your allotted half-hour without ever once actually going anywhere at all. The purpose behind the masking, once you sit with it, is almost dizzying in its thoroughness. It is not enough, apparently, that you cannot speak to your fellow prisoners. The separate system's architects worried that even the simple sight of a familiar face might permit some small thread of human connection, or, worse, some future criminal collaboration once you were both eventually released. Decided that anonymity needed to extend even to the most basic visual recognition of another human being's features. You might, for all you know, be walking in a circle for months alongside a man who lived 2 streets from your childhood home, a man whose face you would recognize instantly under any other circumstances, and you would never know it. Not once, for the entire duration of both your sentences, 2 strangers manufactured out of 2 people who might otherwise have been neighbours, simply through the deliberate, systematic denial of eye contact. It produces, among the shuffling ranks of masked or capped prisoners, an atmosphere that visiting journalists and reformers occasionally described with genuine unease. Less like a prison exercise yard, and more like some strange, silent religious procession, dozens of anonymous grey figures circling endlessly beneath a patch of open sky, each one locked as completely inside his own isolation out here in the fresh air as he was back in his stone cell. The fresh air itself, whatever small mercy it represents, comes tinged with its own particular cruelty, since half an hour of walking in a slow monitored circle, spaced carefully apart, silent, masked or capped, offers barely a fraction of the relief a genuinely free walk outdoors might provide. You feel the sun, when it appears, on your face for the first time in what might be days, and the sensation is disorienting in its intensity. A small, ordinary pleasure that your body seems to have half forgotten how to properly register after so many hours spent inside grey stone walls. You notice, too, small sounds carried on the open air that never reach your cell. A distant church bell from somewhere beyond the prison walls, the faint cry of a gull passing overhead entirely indifferent to the several dozen anonymous men marching in careful circles below it. Small, ordinary fragments of the outside world's continued indifferent existence, offered up almost as a taunt before the half-hour ends and you are marched, single file, silent, masked, back through the heavy doors, and returned once again to your stone box to resume whatever labour quota awaits you for the remainder of the afternoon. You find yourself, during these strange silent circuits, developing an unexpectedly acute awareness of the sky itself, tracking the particular colour and movement of clouds with an attentiveness you never once bothered to cultivate during your old life, when the sky was simply always available, always there, never rationed out in careful 30-minute increments like every other small pleasure, inside these walls. A particularly vivid sunset, glimpsed during a late afternoon exercise period, becomes, you realise with some embarrassment, one of the genuine highlights of your entire week, a small, free, entirely unplanned gift from the heavens that the prison authorities have not yet found any way to ration, censor or withhold from you, though you privately suspect that if they could find a method, they would consider it seriously. The other masked or capped figures shuffling around you in their own careful circles seem, from what little you can observe of their posture and gait, to to be engaged in the same quiet private appreciation, heads tilted very slightly upward whenever the warder's attention drifts elsewhere. Dozens of anonymous men united, however briefly and however wordlessly, in their shared hunger for a piece of open sky that costs the institution nothing at all to provide, and yet somehow still manages to feel like the single most valuable thing available to you inside these walls. You notice, too, the particular ritual some prisoners develop around counting their own laps of the yard. A private, silent accounting system not unlike the one you have already adopted for tracking your crank revolutions, each completed circuit logged mentally against some internal tally that offers, if nothing else, a small sense of measurable progress through an otherwise entirely undifferentiated half-hour. The exercise itself, whatever its officially stated purpose regarding physical health, seems to function rather more as a pressure valve, a brief release of pent-up stillness before you are returned once again to the confined stillness of your cell, and you find yourself, on the mornings when weather or discipline denies you your allotted turn in the yard, feeling the absence of it far more acutely than you would ever have predicted possible before your sentence began. On Sunday morning, and on certain weekday mornings besides, you are marched under close supervision to the prison chapel, and it is here, more than almost anywhere else within these walls, that the sheer architectural obsession with keeping you separate from your fellow prisoners reaches its strange, almost theatrical peak. Rather than pews, the chapel is fitted with tall, narrow individual wooden stalls, each one just wide enough for a single-seated prisoner, walled on either side by high partitions that rise well above head height, so that once you are seated and the small door of your stall latched behind you, you can see directly ahead toward the pulpit, and absolutely nothing else. No fellow worshippers. No familiar or unfamiliar faces, nothing but a narrow wedge of your own private field of vision aimed squarely at the chaplain standing above the assembled, invisible, entirely silent congregation. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most genuinely bizarre pieces of religious architecture ever seriously commissioned in England. An entire chapel built from the ground up around the principle that even communal worship, that most ancient and universally shared of human activities, must somehow be individually partitioned, sanitist of any possibility of a shared glance, a whispered amen, a sideways nod of recognition between two men kneeling only a few feet apart, yet utterly invisible to one another. From the chaplain's elevated vantage point at the pulpit, the effect must have been genuinely strange as well. A sea of disembodied heads poking up above a grid of wooden partitions, dozens of prisoners rendered simultaneously present and entirely isolated, gathered together in the same room for the explicit purpose of collective worship, while being kept as thoroughly separated as if they were, still locked individually in their cells. The chaplain himself occupies a peculiar and genuinely important position within the entire Victorian prison apparatus, considerably more central to daily operations than his modest job title might suggest to modern ears. Reformers of the separate system placed enormous, almost disproportionate faith in the chaplain's capacity to guide prisoners toward genuine moral transformation, reasoning that a man left entirely alone with his conscience, denied every worldly distraction, would naturally gravitate toward religious reflection given the proper spiritual guidance, and the chaplain was expected to provide exactly that guidance, through regular sermons, scripture readings, and, crucially, individual visits to prisoners' cells that we will examine more closely before the night is through. Sunday service itself follows a familiar liturgical shape, hymns, prayers, a lengthy sermon typically focused with unsurprising thematic consistency on repentance, redemption, and the transformative power of suffering patiently endured, though the actual experience of participating feels considerably stranger than the words on the page might suggest. Hymn singing, one of the very few forms of vocalization actually permitted, and indeed actively encouraged under the silent system, produces an oddly moving effect. Dozens of individually isolated, otherwise silent men suddenly permitted to raise their voices together in the same simple melody. a small weekly window in which shared human expression is not merely tolerated, but genuinely required. And more than one prisoner later recalled these brief hymns as among the only moments of felt connection to another living soul across their entire sentence, however indirect and impersonal that connection through partitioned wooden stalls might actually be. The sermon that follows the hymns tends toward the vivid and the theologically uncompromising, chaplains of the era rarely shying away from detailed, occasionally quite dramatic descriptions of sin, judgment, and the eternal consequences awaiting those who failed to properly repent, delivered with the practised cadence of a man who has given essentially the same speech, with minor variations, to several thousand anonymous grey uniformed heads poking up above wooden partitions over the course of his career. You sit in your narrow stall, forbidden as ever from turning to see whether the man in the next stall along is nodding along or dozing quietly behind his partition, absorbing whatever moral instruction the chaplain has prepared for the week, and you find, somewhat to your own surprise, that after enough silent, isolated days spent turning your own thoughts over and over with nothing else to occupy them, the sermon lands rather differently than it might have back in your old parish church, where you likely spent half the service quietly planning your Sunday dinner instead of actually listening. Here, starved of virtually every other form of intellectual or emotional stimulation, the chaplain's words carry an outsized weight, seized upon and turned over repeatedly during the long silent hours back in your cell, in a manner the system's architects had rather cynically, or perhaps rather sincerely, hoped for all along. By the time the closing hymn fades and you are marched back out of the partitioned chapel toward your cell, you carry with you a small, uncomfortable residue of the morning sermon, turning its warnings and its promises over in your mind the way you might worry at a loose thread, and you reflect, not for the first time, that a system so thoroughly dedicated to isolating you from every other human being has nonetheless found one reliable weekly method of getting directly, uninterrupted, and at considerable length, straight inside your head. You notice, glancing upward during a particularly stirring passage of hymn, the elaborate ironwork and careful joinery of the partition dividers themselves, and you find yourself, in an idle, half-formed way, admiring the sheer architectural commitment involved in building an entire chapel around the principle of mutual invisibility. A level of craftsmanship and expense that a less imaginative institution might simply have skipped by allowing prisoners to sit together in ordinary pews and trusting the silent system's other, considerably cheaper enforcement mechanisms to handle the risk of contamination. Somebody, somewhere, sat down with an architect's plans and carefully specified the exact height each partition needed to reach in order to block one seated man's view of his neighbour while still permitting a clear sight line toward the pulpit. A genuinely strange, almost obsessive attention to detail that captures, better than almost anything else you have yet encountered inside these walls. The sheer earnest thoroughness with which the entire separate system was conceived and executed by men who clearly believed, with total sincerity, that they were engaged in a serious, considered, carefully engineered project of moral reform rather than simply building an elaborate machine for making several hundred men feel permanently, comprehensively alone. The organ, when the chapel is fortunate enough to possess one, provides one further small mercy amid the partitioned isolation, its rich, resonant tones filling the entire vaulted space in a way that no individual voice, however sincere, could ever hope to match, and you find yourself genuinely moved, on more than one Sunday, by the sheer physical sensation of that sound washing over you. Vibrating faintly through the wooden partition at your back, a reminder that beauty, however filtered through institutional purpose, has not been entirely banished from your existence just yet. Some chaplains, you gather, took evident pride in cultivating their chapel choirs and musical accompaniment specifically because they recognized, whether through genuine theological insight or simple practical observation, that music succeeded in reaching prisoners in places that straightforward preaching alone never quite managed to penetrate, a small, grudging admission, buried somewhere in the architecture of hymn and organ pipe, that perhaps total isolation was never quite the complete answer the system's designers had originally hoped. It would be. Beyond the Sunday sermon delivered from the safe elevated distance of the chapel pulpit, the chaplain also makes the rounds of individual cells throughout the week, and it is during these one-on-one visits, standing or seated just inside your own narrow doorway, that you receive the closest thing available in this entire institution to an actual conversation with another human being. The chaplain's role within the separate system was never intended as a minor pastoral courtesy tacked onto the edges of an otherwise purely punitive machine. Reformers like the prison inspector who championed Pentonville's design believed, with genuine and considerable sincerity, that solitary confinement combined with regular spiritual guidance represented the single most effective mechanism ever devised for turning a criminal into a reformed, God-fearing citizen, and the chaplain was expected to serve as the primary agent of that transformation, visiting each prisoner under his care with a frequency and attentiveness that, on paper at least, looks remarkably close to genuine pastoral concern. He asks after your health, your state of mind, whether you have been attending properly to the scripture readings left in your cell, whether you have given proper thought to the nature of your crime and the path that led you here. You find yourself, somewhat to your own surprise, genuinely eager for these visits, not necessarily out of any sudden deep religious conviction, but simply because the chaplain represents, for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, an actual voice directed specifically and personally at you, rather than the barked instructions and flat institutional commands that constitute the entirety of your other verbal interactions within these walls. The conversations themselves range considerably depending on the individual chaplain's temperament and theological leanings, some approaching their duties with genuine warmth and evident concern for your well-being, others treating the visit as one more box to tick on an already overstuffed daily rota, moving briskly through a standard set of questions before hurrying on to the next cell on his list. You learn fairly quickly which type of chaplain you have been assigned, and you adjust your own responses accordingly, offering the earnest, contrite answers you suspect he wants to hear, regardless of how closely they actually track your genuine internal state. Because a favourable report from the chaplain carries real, tangible weight within the system, influencing everything from your treatment by warders to your eventual prospects under whatever mark or progressive stage system the institution happens to be experimenting with. There is something quietly performative about the whole exchange, both parties engaged in a kind of careful theatre, the chaplain performing earnest spiritual concern, you performing earnest spiritual progress, each of you aware, at some level, of the transactional undercurrent running beneath the ostensibly purely religious surface of the conversation. Yet beneath the performance, something genuine does occasionally flicker through. Chaplains of the period documented, in their own diaries and official reports submitted to prison governors and parliamentary committees, cases of prisoners breaking down entirely during these visits, weeks or months of enforced silence finally cracking open all at once in the presence of a sympathetic ear, confessions and grief and fear pouring out in a flood that the chaplain, whatever his personal limitations, was frequently the only person in the entire institution positioned to receive. You find yourself on one particular visit some weeks into your sentence, unexpectedly, embarrassingly close to tears simply from being asked, directly and with apparent sincerity, how you are actually holding up, a question so ordinary, so basic, that you had almost forgotten what it felt like to be asked it by another living person. The chaplain, to his credit, does not rush you, sitting with the sudden silence that follows your failed attempt to answer steadily, and you understand, in that strange, raw moment, precisely why the architects of this system placed such enormous weight on his role. because in a world constructed so thoroughly and deliberately around the deprivation of human connection, even this modest, transactional, theatrically tinged relationship becomes, almost by default, the single most emotionally significant bond available to you. Not every chaplain lived up to the weight of that responsibility, of course, and prison records from the period are littered with complaints, both from prisoners and from concerned outside reformers, about chaplains who treated their rounds with bureaucratic indifference, rushing through cell visits with the same hurried, box-ticking energy of a man late for his own dinner. Some prisoners, hardened by repeated disappointment, came to view the chaplain's visits with open cynicism, correctly identifying the performative element and refusing to participate in it beyond the bare minimum required to avoid an unfavourable mark against their name. But for you, at least for now, in these early months of your sentence, the chaplain's weekly appearance at your cell door remains something you find yourself, despite every instinct toward guarded suspicion, quietly looking forward to. A small scheduled window in an otherwise featureless week during which you are, however briefly and however conditionally, treated as a person rather than a number. You begin, over the following months, to notice the chaplain aging in small increments alongside you, a slight new stoop to his shoulders, a deepening of the lines around his eyes, and it strikes you, somewhat unexpectedly, that this man carries his own considerable burden walking these galleries day after day, absorbing in careful, measured doses the accumulated grief, fear, and quiet desperation of several hundred isolated men, each one hungry for exactly the kind of individual attention he alone is positioned to provide. You wonder, idly, whether he sleeps easily at night, whether the sheer volume of confession and despair he absorbs on his rounds ever follows him home, the way the silence of your own cell follows you into your dreams. And you find yourself, in a strange reversal of the usual dynamic, feeling something oddly close to concern for the man whose visits represent your single most valuable weekly resource. Some chaplains, you gather from careful, whispered fragments passed along the gallery, eventually grew disillusioned with the theoretical promises of the separate system, writing privately, and sometimes not so privately, to prison inspectors and reform societies about cases of genuine psychological breakdown among their most isolated charges, men whose minds seem to unravel despite, or perhaps because of, exactly the kind of sustained spiritual attention the system's architects had originally envisioned as the cure. Your own chaplain says nothing so explicit during his visits to you, maintaining always the same careful, professional composure, but you notice on occasion a flicker of something that might be doubt crossing his features when a particular question about your well-being goes unanswered a beat too long, a small crack in the institutional confidence that the system, whatever its flaws, is nonetheless working exactly as intended. Periodically, and always without warning that would allow you to properly prepare, a warder arrives at your cell and marches you to the small spare room maintained by the prison's medical officer, where you strip to the waist and submit to an examination conducted with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a man who has, by this point in his career, seen every possible variation of prison malady pass through his door and long ago stopped being surprised by any of it. The prison surgeon's official responsibilities extend considerably beyond simple wound treatment or the occasional bout of fever, encompassing a genuinely peculiar dual role that sits at the very heart of the separate system's internal contradictions. On one hand, he exists to preserve your basic physical viability, monitoring your weight, your pulse, the general condition of your body under the combined strain of poor diet, hard labour, and prolonged isolation. Because a prisoner who dies in custody generates paperwork, scrutiny, and the sort of awkward parliamentary questions that prison governors would very much prefer to avoid. On the other hand, and this is the part that takes considerably longer to fully absorb, the surgeon also functions as a kind of gatekeeper for the system's more severe punishments, required to certify that a prisoner sentenced to flogging or extended solitary confinement in the darkened punishment cells is medically fit to endure it. a role that places him in the genuinely uncomfortable position of using his medical judgment not to prevent suffering, but to calibrate precisely how much of it your particular body can be expected to survive. You stand before him, cataloguing in your own mind the various new aches and pains accumulated since your last examination, the persistent stiffness in your crank-turning shoulder, the calloused, cracked skin across your oakum-picking fingers, a vague, hollow fatigue that never quite lifts regardless of how many hours you spend on your plank bed, and he notes each complaint with the flat, professional detachment of a man filling in yet another line on yet another form. Prison medical officers of the period documented, with a consistency that later historians would find genuinely alarming once they began compiling the surviving records, a whole catalogue of complaints disproportionately common among prisoners subjected to the separate system's extended isolation, chronic digestive troubles stemming from the thin, monotonous diet, persistent headaches and nervous complaints that today's medicine would likely categorize under anxiety or depression, and, in the more severe and genuinely tragic cases, symptoms of what contemporary doctors termed prison psychosis or moral insanity, hallucinations, incoherent speech, a kind of hollow-eyed withdrawal from reality that no amount of scripture reading or chaplain's visits seemed capable of reversing once it had properly taken hold. You have heard whispered rumours through the careful, wordless communication network that prisoners maintain despite every institutional effort to prevent it, of men in nearby cells who stopped responding to their own names entirely, who spent their exercise yard half-hour staring blankly at nothing rather than walking their allotted circuit, who were eventually removed to the infirmary or transferred elsewhere and never spoken of again. The surgeon examining you today has almost certainly seen several such cases pass through his own small examination room, and there is something faintly chilling about watching him work through his standard checklist of questions, aware that he is quite literally screening for the earliest signs of a mind beginning to come apart under the strain of exactly the conditions you yourself are currently enduring. The examination concludes, as it generally does, with a brief, business-like pronouncement of your overall fitness, fit for continued labour, fit to remain in the separate system, no immediate cause for concern noted in the official record, and you are dismissed back to the custody of the waiting warder and marched back toward your cell, carrying with you the small, complicated relief of having passed inspection alongside the considerably less comfortable awareness of everything the surgeon's checklist implicitly reveals about the toll this institution routinely takes on the men passing through it. Later in the century, as mounting evidence of psychological deterioration among long-term separate system prisoners accumulated in surgeons' own reports, parliamentary committees would eventually take genuine notice, contributing to a gradual grudging softening of the strictest isolation policies at institutions like Pentonville, a slow admission, buried in bureaucratic language across decades of official correspondence, that perhaps total silence and total solitude were not, after all, the perfectly calibrated instruments of moral reformation their original architects had so confidently believed them to be. For now, though, none of that reform has quite reached you yet, and you return to your cell simply grateful in the narrow, conditional way available to you here, that today at least your own mind and body have been officially certified as still holding together. You find yourself thinking, in the hours following your examination, about the peculiar arithmetic underlying the surgeon's role within this institution, a man trained to heal and preserve life pressed into service determining precisely how much punishment a particular body can be made to endure before it becomes, in the flat administrative language of the official record, medically inadvisable to continue. It is a strange, uncomfortable thought to sit with, that the very same professional judgment protecting you from outright fatal neglect is also the judgment that certifies whether you are fit enough to be flogged. And you find yourself, not for the first time since your arrival, marvelling at the sheer bureaucratic ingenuity required to build an institution in which even mercy and cruelty share. The exact same clipboard, The surgeon's records, you learn much later through occasional fragments of overheard conversation between warders discussing prison business, are also quietly feeding a growing body of evidence back toward the reform-minded members of Parliament who periodically investigate conditions across the prison system, statistics on weight loss, on reported nervous complaints, on the alarming frequency of what the medical men still struggle to properly name or categorize, slowly accumulating into the kind of documented pattern that no amount of earnest theoretical conviction can indefinitely ignore. You have no way of knowing, sitting in your cell after your own routine examination, that the very numbers being recorded about your own condition today will eventually contribute, in small incremental ways over the coming decades, to a slow, grudging softening of the system currently pressing down on you so completely, a distant, unimaginable comfort that offers you, this particular afternoon, absolutely no practical relief whatsoever. You notice, too, a peculiar tenderness in the way the surgeon occasionally addresses the older prisoners brought before him, men whose bodies have clearly borne the accumulated weight of decades rather than mere months of hard labour, a flicker of genuine professional concern breaking through his otherwise businesslike manner that suggests, whatever the limitations of his role within this larger machine, he has not entirely lost sight of the actual human beings passing through his small examination room. You find yourself watching this small, unguarded moment of decency, unexpectedly moved by it, a reminder that even within a system built with such thorough, deliberate indifference to your comfort, individual kindness has a stubborn habit of finding whatever narrow cracks remain available to it. On the occasions when your body finally, genuinely fails to keep pace with the demands placed upon it, a fever that will not break, a wound from the oakum shed that has turned angry and inflamed, a persistent, rattling cough that no amount of willpower seems able to suppress, you are transferred, at last, out of your solitary cell and into the prison infirmary. A change of scenery that arrives, wrapped in such a strange, unexpected tangle of relief and dread that you hardly know which feeling to trust. The infirmary itself represents one of the very few spaces within the entire institution where the strict architecture of separation genuinely relaxes, prisoners housed together in shared wards under the supervision of a nurse or hospital warder, close enough in adjoining beds to actually see one another's faces, occasionally even close enough to exchange a few careful, quiet words when the attending staff are sufficiently distracted. A small, almost giddy taste of ordinary human proximity after however many weeks or months of enforced solitary existence. You lie in a narrow iron bed, considerably more forgiving than your familiar plank, beneath a blanket that, while not luxurious by any reasonable outside standard, feels genuinely indulgent after the threadbare coverings of your cell, and you find yourself, in your feverish, weakened state, almost embarrassingly grateful for the simple presence of other breathing, coughing, restless bodies scattered across the ward around you. Proof, however miserable the circumstances producing it, that you have not been entirely forgotten by the world of the living. Medical treatment available to you, it must be said honestly, remains firmly rooted in the considerable limitations of Victorian medicine more broadly, a discipline still years away from germ theory's widespread acceptance and reliant on a toolkit that, from a modern vantage point, looks distinctly more hopeful than reliably effective. Fevers are treated with rest, reduced diet, and cooling compresses. Wounds are cleaned, dressed, and monitored anxiously for the telltale signs of infection that, in an era before antibiotics, could transform a minor cut sustained during oakum labour into a genuinely life-threatening complication within a matter of days. Coughs and chest complaints, endemic throughout institutions built from cold, damp stone and populated by men whose resistance has already been worn thin by poor diet and relentless labour, receive whatever combination of rest and basic remedies the prison surgeon has available, sometimes effective, sometimes not, the outcome frequently determined as much by the individual patient's underlying constitution as by any particular medical intervention applied on his behalf. You have heard, again through the careful whispered network prisoners maintain, of men who entered the infirmary with what seemed like minor complaints and never emerged from it at all, their names quietly removed from the daily roll call and never mentioned again, a grim but not entirely uncommon outcome in institutions where malnutrition, overcrowding in earlier prisons, and the general physical toll of hard labour combined to make even ordinary illnesses considerably more dangerous than they might have proven outside the walls. And yet, despite the genuine medical limitations and the persistent undertone of mortality hovering around any extended infirmary stay, there remains something almost perversely restorative about the experience, precisely because it represents, for however brief and medically unfortunate a window, a partial suspension of the separate system's most punishing features. You are not required to pick oakum from your infirmary bed. You are not marched to the treadwheel or seated before the crank machine while running a genuine fever. The rule of silence loosens somewhat here too. Nurses and attendants exchanging brief practical instructions with patients that would constitute a serious breach of discipline anywhere else in the institution. And you find yourself, in your weakened and thoroughly miserable physical state, nonetheless experiencing something disturbingly close to relief at the temporary reprieve from your normal daily routine. Some prisoners, records suggest with a certain dark, unspoken irony that the Victorian authorities themselves seemed only partially aware of. Occasionally exaggerated minor complaints or delayed reporting genuine recovery, angling for just a few more days in the comparatively gentler confines of the infirmary ward before being returned to the full rigours of separate confinement, a small, human, entirely understandable act of quiet rebellion against a system that had, by this point, made even illness feel like a mercy by comparison. Eventually, whether through genuine recovery or the surgeon's judgment that you have sufficiently improved, regardless of how you personally feel about the timeline, you are pronounced fit and marched back to your familiar stone cell, the plank bed, the crank machine bolted to the wall, the silent, solitary hours stretching out ahead of you once again in their accustomed, unbroken rhythm. The infirmary recedes behind you, a strange, feverish, half-remembered interlude of shared beds and murmured voices, and you settle back into the rigid architecture of separation with the particular heaviness of a man who has just been reminded, in the sharpest possible terms, exactly how much he has been missing. You find yourself, in the days immediately following your discharge from the ward, replaying small fragments of overheard conversation with an almost obsessive fondness, a nurse's brief remark about the weather, a fellow patient's half-muttered joke about the quality of the infirmary broth, tiny ordinary scraps of human exchange that would have registered as utterly unremarkable in your old life and now feel, in retrospect, like some of the richest social contact you have experienced in months. You catalogue these memories carefully, the way you might catalogue a small hoard of coins, turning them over during the long silent hours of your ordinary labour, and you understand, with a certain rueful clarity, precisely how thoroughly this institution has recalibrated your own sense of what constitutes genuine abundance. Prison reformers of the period occasionally proposed, with the same earnest theoretical confidence that produced the separate system in the first place, that infirmary conditions ought to be kept deliberately spare and unwelcoming specifically to discourage prisoners from feigning illness, purely to access its comparatively gentler regime. A policy debate that rumbled on in official correspondence and parliamentary committee reports throughout the middle decades of the century, without ever quite resolving itself to anyone's full satisfaction. You have little patience, lying weakened in your narrow cell bed after your return, for the finer points of that particular administrative argument, occupied instead with the considerably more immediate business of nursing your own returning strength, one slow, silent, solitary day at a time, back toward whatever baseline of endurance your labour quota will shortly require of you once again. For a breach of discipline serious enough to escalate beyond a simple reprimand a whispered word exchanged in the exercise yard, an insufficiently respectful glance toward a warder, a refusal to meet your daily labour quota, you are marched, under close and distinctly unfriendly escort, toward a separate wing of the prison reserved specifically for punishment, and it is here that you discover the dark cell, a room that makes your ordinary quarters feel, by grim comparison, almost cheerful. The punishment cell, sometimes called the dark cell or the refractory cell depending on the particular institution's preferred terminology, strips away every remaining small comfort your regular cell still technically provided. There is no plank bed here, or if there is one, it may be removed entirely, or replaced with a bare stone or iron surface, offering none of the modest cushioning your usual straw mattress provided. There is no window, or the window that exists has been deliberately blocked or shuttered, plunging the space into a darkness so total and unbroken that your eyes, straining desperately for any point of reference whatsoever, eventually simply give up the search. Some institutions equip these punishment cells with double doors, an outer door and an inner door, both fitted so precisely and solidly that virtually no sound, no light, no trace of the outside world penetrates through to wherever you now sit, curled against the cold stone. Trying to remember what your own hand looks like since you genuinely cannot see it in front of your face. Rations, too, shrink considerably during your confinement here, often reduced to bread and water alone, the modest gruel and occasional scrap of meat that constitutes your regular diet suspended entirely for the duration of your punishment. A further layer of deprivation stacked deliberately atop the sensory isolation already pressing in from every direction. Time itself becomes almost impossible to track with any reliability once inside the dark cell, the absence of any visible daylight or audible bell severing your connection to the ordinary rhythm of hours and days that structures every other part of your imprisonment. However punishing that structure normally feels, you find yourself within what you estimate to be perhaps the first several hours, though you genuinely cannot be certain, developing an acute, almost desperate hunger for any form of sensory input whatsoever, straining your ears for the faintest sound, running your fingertips repeatedly along the same small section of stone wall, simply to have something, anything, to occupy your rapidly fraying attention. Prison reformers and medical officers of the period, to their genuine credit, eventually began documenting with real alarm the psychological effects of extended dark cell confinement, prisoners emerging after several days in total sensory deprivation, exhibiting symptoms ranging from acute anxiety and disorientation to, in more severe and thoroughly documented cases, genuine hallucinations, hearing voices or seeing shapes moving in the absolute darkness that simply were not there. The mind's own desperate, misfiring attempt to manufacture stimulation in the total absence of any external input. You have heard whispered accounts, again through the prison's persistent informal grapevine, of men who emerged from extended dark cell punishment fundamentally changed, quieter, hollower, carrying some invisible residue of those unbroken hours of total sensory absence that never entirely seemed to lift even weeks later. The official justification for the dark cell, articulated by prison authorities with the same earnest institutional confidence applied to virtually every other punishing feature of the separate system, held that a brief period of total isolation, stripped even of the minimal stimulation your ordinary cell provided, would serve as a powerful, memorable deterrent against future breaches of discipline, the theory being that a prisoner who had genuinely experienced the full weight of total sensory deprivation would think considerably harder before risking a repeat visit. In practice, the punishment proved so genuinely severe, and its documented psychological consequences so consistently alarming to prison medical officers required to certify prisoners fit to endure it, that its use gradually, grudgingly declined across the latter decades of the century as accumulating evidence made an increasingly uncomfortable case against it, though it never entirely disappeared from the disciplinary toolkit available to prison governors throughout your own era of confinement. Emerging finally back into your ordinary cell after several days in the darkness, you find the thin grey daylight filtering through your familiar high window almost unbearably bright, your eyes watering and squinting against a level of illumination you would, under any other circumstances, have considered barely worth noticing at all, a small involuntary physical testament to just how thoroughly the darkness had rewritten, however temporarily, your basic relationship with the ordinary sensory world. You find in the days following your release from the dark cell that ordinary sounds carry a strange, heightened intensity you had not previously noticed. The clatter of a food trolley, the distant tolling of the bell, each one landing with an almost startling clarity after the total prolonged silence you have just emerged from, as though your ears themselves have been somehow sharpened by their extended deprivation. You catch yourself, too, flinching at shadows in your ordinary cell that never troubled you before, small dark corners your mind now populates, however briefly and however irrationally, with the same imagined shapes that plagued you during your confinement in total darkness, a lingering residue that takes considerably longer to fade than the physical stiffness in your limbs. Parliamentary inspectors who eventually toured institutions employing extended dark cell punishment, arriving with notebooks and earnest theoretical questions about discipline and deterrence, occasionally emerged from their own brief supervised visits to the punishment wing looking visibly shaken, unable to fully reconcile the abstract administrative language of their official reports with the raw, immediate physical horror of standing even briefly inside a space engineered so completely around the total absence of light and sound. You have no access to their reports, of course, sitting in your own ordinary cell turning the memory of the darkness over and over in your mind, but you find yourself hoping, with a quiet, stubborn persistence, that somewhere in the machinery of this vast institutional system, someone with genuine power is beginning to ask the same uncomfortable questions the darkness itself seemed to be asking you, over and over, for every single one of those endless, silent, unmeasured hours. You find, in the weeks that follow, that you have developed a small, private ritual of gratitude each time the ordinary bell sounds to mark the ordinary transitions of your ordinary, difficult day, a genuine and somewhat startling appreciation for ordinary structure itself, the plank bed, the thin gruel, even the crank machine's dull ache, all of it suddenly rendered, by grim comparison, into something almost approaching comfort. It is a strange kind of lesson, you think, that it apparently took total darkness and total silence to teach you just how much relative mercy your ordinary, thoroughly miserable cell actually contained all along. For breaches of discipline that fall short of warranting the dark cell, but still exceed a warder's patience for a simple verbal reprimand, the prison maintains a whole graduated ladder of punishments, and you learn through whispered warnings passed carefully between prisoners and through your own occasional direct experience, precisely how each rung of that ladder feels once you have been unfortunate enough to climb it. Bread and water, the most commonly applied punishment for relatively minor infractions, sounds almost gentle stated plainly, a temporary reduction of your already Spartan diet down to its barest possible components. But the reality, sustained over several consecutive days, proves considerably more punishing than the simple phrase suggests. Your gruel disappears entirely from the schedule. Your modest ration of meat or cheese, on the days it would ordinarily have appeared, vanishes as well. You are left with bread alone, a slightly larger portion than your usual ration in some institutions, though hardly generous, and water, nothing more, 3 times daily, delivered through the same small hatch that normally brings your skilly, and you discover within a single day just how quickly the mind's constant low-grade hunger transforms into something sharper, more insistent, harder to simply push aside and ignore while attempting to focus on your labour quota. Combined with the physical demands of the crank or the treadwheel, which authorities rarely suspend simply because your rations have been reduced. Bread and water punishment leaves you genuinely weakened, your concentration fraying, your temper, already worn thin by months of accumulated deprivation, growing shorter and more brittle with each passing hour of reduced sustenance. For more serious offences, striking a warder, persistent and defiant refusal to work, repeated attempts to communicate with fellow prisoners despite prior warnings, the punishment escalates to corporal correction, the birch or the cat, administered under formal procedure requiring the prison surgeon's certification that you are medically fit to endure it, a grim bureaucratic checkpoint that somehow makes the whole proceeding feel simultaneously more official and more chilling. You are restrained, the details of the apparatus varying somewhat by institution, and the punishment delivered by a warder specifically designated and, in some cases, specially trained for the task. A fixed number of strokes recorded meticulously afterward in yet another official ledger alongside your name. Or rather, your number and the specific nature of your offence. The physical pain is, unsurprisingly, considerable and immediate, but prisoners and reformers alike, writing later in memoirs and parliamentary testimony, tended to emphasise a different, longer-lasting wound, the genuine psychological humiliation of corporal punishment administered within a system already built entirely around stripping away every last trace of personal dignity. One more deliberate reminder, delivered directly and unmistakably to your body, of precisely how little control you retain over your own physical person while inside these walls. The formal machinery surrounding punishment, the surgeon's certification, the careful ledger entries, the graduated scale running from bread and water through solitary confinement up to corporal correction, reflects the same obsessive Victorian institutional impulse toward documentation and procedure that governed literally every other aspect of your imprisonment, your rations, your labour quotas. Your medical examinations, all of it recorded, tabulated and filed away with a bureaucratic thoroughness that stands in genuinely strange contrast to the raw, visceral human suffering the paperwork so carefully describes. You come to understand, watching this system operate around you and occasionally experiencing its sharper edges directly, that the entire apparatus runs on a kind of institutional faith in consequences, precisely measured, precisely documented, precisely applied, as though moral reformation were fundamentally a matter of sufficiently rigorous accounting, rather than anything resembling genuine human transformation. Prisoners who accumulated repeated marks against their record found their prospects narrowing considerably, delayed consideration for whatever privileges the mark system offered, a longer road back toward eventual release, while those who managed to avoid punishment's ladder entirely, through whatever combination of genuine compliance and simple good fortune, found their path through the system marginally, though only marginally, smoother. You resolve, following your own brief and thoroughly unpleasant encounter with the bread and water rung of that ladder, to avoid climbing any further up it if you can possibly help it, though you notice, with a particular dark clarity that seems to develop naturally after enough months inside these walls, that resolve alone offers only a limited defence against a system with quite so many opportunities, quite so many small arbitrary infractions available for a tired, hungry, thoroughly worn-down prisoner to accidentally commit on any given afternoon. You notice, watching the punishment ledger occasionally glimpsed during a warder's careless moment, that certain prisoners appear on its pages with a regularity that suggests something considerably more complicated than simple defiance. Men whose repeated infractions seem to track more closely with the particular warder assigned to their gallery on any given week than with any consistent pattern. Of their own behaviour, a small, quiet piece of evidence that the entire disciplinary system, for all its careful bureaucratic documentation, ultimately rests on the same imperfect, inconsistent human judgment it was ostensibly designed to remove from the equation. you resolve, privately, to keep your own conduct as unremarkable and forgettable as possible. Understanding, with a particular clarity that comes from watching other men suffer the consequences of drawing unwanted attention, that survival within this system depends less on genuine moral virtue than on the considerably more modest skill of simply staying beneath its notice. Reform-minded observers of the period, when finally permitted access to examine institutional punishment records, expressed genuine alarm at the sheer volume and pettiness of many recorded infractions, prisoners punished for infractions as minor as an improperly folded blanket or an insufficiently respectful tone of voice, a pattern that gradually contributed, alongside the mounting medical evidence of psychological harm, to a slow, grudging reconsideration of the separate system's harsher disciplinary tools across the later decades of the century. For now, though, none of that eventual reconsideration offers you any practical comfort, and you carry forward through the remainder of your sentence the same careful, constant vigilance you have already learned to apply to every other aspect of your confinement, watching your own posture, your own tone, your own small daily choices with the wary attentiveness of a man who has learned, the hard way, exactly how thin the line can be between an ordinary difficult day and a considerably more punishing one. The men who move through the galleries above and around your cell, keys jangling at their belts in a sound you have come to associate with every meaningful change in your day, occupy a genuinely strange position within the whole architecture of your imprisonment, close enough to shape virtually every moment of your existence, and yet almost entirely withheld from you as actual people. Warders in institutions like Pentonville were themselves subject to a strict, almost military code of conduct, expected to maintain the silent system's discipline not merely by enforcing it upon you, but by largely embodying it themselves, communicating instructions in brief clipped phrases, avoiding anything resembling casual conversation or personal warmth that might undermine the institution's carefully constructed atmosphere of total impersonal authority. You come to know your own gallery's warder by the particular rhythm of his footsteps long before you ever properly study his face, a heavy, measured tread that you learn to distinguish from the lighter, quicker steps of the younger warder who covers the opposite wing, each set of footfalls carrying its own small, private significance in the otherwise largely silent soundscape of your days. He appears at your door's small hinged flap at irregular intervals throughout the day and night, checking that you remain exactly where regulations require you to be, occupied with exactly the labour assigned to you, and you learn, with the wary vigilance of a man whose every action is subject to invisible scrutiny, to maintain a particular posture of visible, unambiguous compliance whenever that flap might conceivably slide open, because the gap between a warder's favourable and unfavourable impression of you translates, in very concrete terms, into the difference between a manageable sentence and one considerably harder. Not every warder, it must be said, approaches the role with identical temperament, and prisoners across the century left behind, in memoirs and testimony submitted to the various parliamentary committees that periodically investigated prison conditions, a genuinely wide spectrum of accounts ranging from grudging respect for warders who applied the rules firmly but fairly, to bitter, lasting resentment toward others who seemed to take a genuine, unsettling pleasure in the small cruelties their position permitted them, tightening a crank's resistance screw out of pure spite, reporting a minor infraction with more severity than the circumstances warranted, extending a punishment period by a day or two through nothing more than casual, unaccountable discretion. The job itself, it is worth remembering, offered its own considerable hardships. Warders working long, exhausting shifts for modest wages, subject to their own strict hierarchy of governors and inspectors, expected to maintain total vigilance across dozens of individual prisoners simultaneously while themselves forbidden from any real camaraderie with the men under their watch, a peculiar kind of institutional loneliness running in an odd, unacknowledged parallel to your own. You catch occasionally small unguarded flickers of the actual person behind the uniform, a warder who lingers half a second longer than strictly necessary at your door on a particularly difficult day, offering nothing so bold as an actual kind word, but perhaps the faintest suggestion of one in his expression, or another who mentions, almost accidentally, some small detail about weather outside the walls that technically violates the spirit, if not quite the letter of his own institutional reticence. The warder's authority within your daily life is, in practice, almost total, and the system deliberately concentrates enormous discretionary power in their hands precisely because so much of your treatment depends on judgments made in the moment, at your cell door, in the exercise yard, in the workshop, judgments that no distant governor or chaplain will ever directly witness or verify. You learn quickly which small behaviours earn a warder's approval, and which invite suspicion, adjusting your posture, your pace, your expression, with the same careful, constant vigilance you might once have reserved for genuinely dangerous situations. Because in here, in a very real sense, every situation carries at least a small element of genuine danger, the danger of an unfavourable mark, a reduced privilege, an extended sentence achieved through nothing more dramatic than a warder's accumulated unfavourable impressions over the preceding weeks. It is exhausting, this constant low-grade performance of ideal prisoner behaviour, sustained not for any internal reward, but purely for the external judgment of men who will never actually know you, never learn your real name, never have the faintest interest in who you were before you became simply a number moving predictably through their assigned section of the institution. By the time you have served enough months to develop a genuine, if entirely one-sided, sense of your gallery warder's individual habits and moods, you find yourself engaged in a strange, silent, entirely unacknowledged relationship with a man who holds enormous power over your daily existence, and yet remains, in every meaningful sense, a total stranger, his actual thoughts and feelings about you as thoroughly unknowable as your own remain to him. Two men separated not merely by the bars and stone between you, but by an entire institutional philosophy explicitly designed to prevent anything resembling genuine mutual recognition from ever taking root. You wonder, on the quieter evenings when your mind drifts towards such things, what your particular warder goes home to at the end of his long shift, whether he has a family waiting for him, small children who greet him at the door entirely unaware of the particular grey, silent, watchful world their father spends his working hours patrolling, and you find the exercise strangely humanizing, imagining this man who holds such enormous, unaccountable power over your daily existence shrinking back down, the moment he steps outside these walls, into something as ordinary and vulnerable as anyone else, tired, hungry, worried about his own rent and his own children's health, entirely indifferent to the vast philosophical weight the separate systems architects have placed on his shoulders during working hours. Some warders, you gather from the careful whispered accounts passed between prisoners, despite every institutional effort to prevent exactly this sort of unauthorized information sharing, eventually left the profession entirely, unable to reconcile the demands of the role with whatever personal conscience they had carried into the job, while others seemed to settle into their authority with an ease that suggested either a genuine natural aptitude for institutional discipline, or, more troublingly, some deeper appetite for the particular flavour of power the position afforded them over men with no meaningful recourse to. Object. You have learned, by this point in your sentence, to read the subtle signs distinguishing one type from the other within the first few days of any new warder's assignment to your gallery. A survival skill you never imagined needing to develop, and one you suspect will linger, quietly useful, long after your own eventual release. Once a week, or on occasions determined by his own schedule and inclination, the prison governor makes his rounds through the galleries, and the entire institution around you shifts, almost imperceptibly, into a slightly different register, warders straightening, movements becoming marginally crisper, the whole machinery of the prison presenting itself, however briefly, in its most polished and orderly light. The governor occupies the very top of the institution's internal hierarchy, answerable ultimately to the Home Office and to whatever prison inspectorate happens to be exercising oversight during your particular era of confinement, and his periodic inspections carry a weight considerably beyond the simple fact of his presence. Since a governor's judgment about the general order and discipline of his institution influences everything from funding to his own professional reputation among the small, tightly interconnected world of Victorian prison administrators, you stand at attention, or as close to attention as your unfamiliar new posture allows, as he passes your cell door, glancing in briefly to confirm that you are appropriately occupied with your labour, that your cell maintains the required standard of cleanliness, that nothing about your bearing suggests the sort of insufficient discipline that might reflect poorly on his own stewardship of the institution. It is, in its own strange way, one of the only moments in your entire week during which the prison's vast, impersonal machinery briefly acknowledges you as an individual case worth a few seconds of direct personal attention from the man at its very top, even if that attention amounts to little more than a cursory, evaluative glance through your open cell door. Some governors of the period genuinely embraced the reformist ideals underpinning the separate system, viewing themselves as engaged in a serious, almost scientific project of moral engineering, meticulously reviewing conduct records, personally interviewing prisoners whose behaviour raised particular concern, corresponding at length with prison inspectors and reform-minded parliamentarians about the theoretical underpinnings of their institution's daily operations. Others approached the role with a more straightforwardly administrative temperament, primarily concerned with maintaining order, meeting labour quotas, and avoiding the sort of scandal or embarrassing incident that might draw unwelcome outside scrutiny toward their establishment. You have little way of knowing, from your narrow vantage point within a single cell, which particular temperament governs the man currently making his way down your gallery, though you gather small clues over time. The tone of his voice when addressing a warder about some minor irregularity, the particular questions he occasionally poses directly to prisoners during his rounds, whether he pauses to actually read the details of your case file or simply confirms your number against, his master list before moving briskly onward to the next cell. The inspection itself, brief as it typically is, carries an outsized psychological weight precisely because it represents one of the very few moments when the entire structure of your confinement becomes visible all at once, from the highest authority in the building down to the humble tin bowl of skilly sitting on your shelf. All of it assembled and displayed, however briefly, for a single evaluating gaze. You find yourself straightening your posture instinctively as his footsteps approach, aware on some deep, almost involuntary level that this moment, however fleeting, represents a genuine opportunity, however small, to distinguish yourself favourably within a system that otherwise processes you almost entirely as an interchangeable unit among many hundreds of identical grey uniformed cases. Occasionally, prisoners with genuine grievances, a dispute over rations, a complaint about a particular warder's conduct, a request regarding their case that has gone unanswered through ordinary channels, seize the rare opportunity of the governor's direct presence to raise the matter aloud, a move that carries real risk, since interrupting the inspection's carefully choreographed rhythm can easily be read as insubordination rather than legitimate grievance, but that occasionally, for the fortunate few, actually produces some small, meaningful change in their circumstances. As the governor's footsteps recede down the gallery toward the next row of cells, the brief charged atmosphere of his visit gradually dissolves back into the institution's ordinary rhythm, warders relaxing fractionally, the whole building settling back into its accustomed grey, silent, watchful routine, and you return to your labour with the small. Strange satisfaction of having survived one more of the periodic moments during which the entire weight of the institution's hierarchy briefly, directly, if only for a few seconds, turned its full attention toward you. You find yourself, in the hours following each inspection, replaying the brief exchange in obsessive detail, parsing the governor's tone, his posture, the particular duration of his glance through your cell door for any hint of the impression you have left behind, a habit that strikes you, on reflection, as faintly absurd given how genuinely minor and forgettable the entire encounter likely registered from his own considerably busier vantage point. And yet the habit persists, because in a life stripped of almost every other form of feedback or external validation, even this smallest, most fleeting moment of evaluation takes on an outsized significance simply by virtue of being one of the very few available. Governors of the period, you gather from occasional fragments of conversation overheard between warders discussing prison business within earshot, faced their own considerable pressures from above, quarterly reports to submit to the Home Office, budgets to justify, escape attempts and disturbances to prevent and explain, a whole parallel hierarchy of scrutiny and accountability stretching upward from your own cell door through the Governor's office and onward toward Whitehall itself. Each level anxious about the judgment of the level above it, in a chain that, you reflect with some dark amusement, ultimately traces its way back to the same earnest parliamentary reformers who dreamed up the entire separate system in the first place, now presumably fielding their own uncomfortable questions about whether their carefully theorized architecture of silence and solitude was actually achieving anything like the moral transformation they had originally promised. After a period determined by the specific rules of your sentence, typically some months into your confinement rather than immediately upon arrival, you are informed that you may write and receive a limited number of letters, a privilege that arrives wrapped in so many restrictions and so much careful institutional scrutiny that the word privilege begins to feel almost sarcastic by the time you actually sit down with the small stub of pencil and single sheet of paper allotted to you. You are permitted, in most establishments operating under the separate system, a single letter every several months, the exact interval varying by institution and by your particular stage within whatever progressive mark system the prison happens to be operating, and you are informed, in no uncertain terms, that every word you write will be read, reviewed, and if necessary struck through or withheld entirely by prison staff before it ever leaves the building, a censorship process so thorough that prisoners quickly learn to write with the careful, deliberate restraint of a man perpetually aware of an invisible reader looking directly over his shoulder. You are forbidden from discussing the specific details of prison conditions, the labour you perform, the punishments you have witnessed or endured, anything that might, in the authorities' judgment, cast the institution in an unfavourable light or provide useful information to anyone contemplating criminal enterprise on the outside. What remains permissible, once you have mentally subtracted every forbidden category, feels almost comically narrow, brief expressions of your health and general well-being, inquiries after your family's own circumstances, perhaps a carefully worded sentiment of remorse or resolve to live better upon your eventual release. Phrases that read, even to your own eye as you compose them, suspiciously close to the sort of language a chaplain might approve of, rather than anything resembling your own natural voice. You spend considerably longer composing this single sheet of paper than the modest word count would seem to warrant, drafting sentences mentally long before committing pencil to paper, since corrections and crossings out are themselves subject to scrutiny, and might be read as evidence of some concealed forbidden content lurking beneath the visible surface of your careful, approved language. You think of your wife, or your mother, or whichever family member sits waiting on the other end of this correspondence, trying to imagine what small comfort or reassurance you might genuinely convey within such narrow permitted boundaries, settling eventually on simple, plain statements, that you remain in reasonable health, that you think of them constantly, that you count the days. Quite literally in your case, scratched carefully into the underside of your cell shelf toward the day you might see them again. The letter, once complete, passes through the chaplain or a designated prison official for review, occasionally return to you with instructions to remove or rewrite a particular passage judged inappropriate. A genuinely humiliating process that reduces even this most intimate and personal form of communication into yet another exercise in institutional compliance. Your private thoughts to your own family filtered, approved, and only then permitted to leave the building bearing the prison's own official stamp somewhere on the envelope. Letters arriving from the outside undergo the identical scrutiny in reverse, opened, read, and in some cases partially redacted before ever reaching your hands. And you receive your own family's careful, similarly restrained correspondence with a hunger that borders on the physical, rereading the same few permitted lines dozens of times over the following days and weeks, searching for hidden warmth and meaning in phrases that were themselves composed under the same anxious, censored constraints governing your own letters. Some prisoners, unable to bear the delay or the restrictions, found themselves growing gradually more distant from family correspondence over the length of a long sentence, the infrequency and impersonality of the whole exchange slowly eroding a connection that might otherwise have remained a genuine lifeline through the isolation. Others clung to their allotted letters with an almost desperate intensity, treating each rare exchange as a precious, carefully rationed resource, and you find yourself, honestly, uncertain yet which category you will eventually fall into. Though for now, holding your single precious sheet of prison paper, watching the ink dry on words far more careful and far less honest than what actually sits in your chest, you understand with total clarity just how thoroughly this institution has managed to reach even into the last remaining channel of connection between yourself and everyone you have ever loved. You spend considerable time, in the weeks following each letter's departure, imagining its journey, the careful hand that will eventually open the envelope, the particular expression that might cross a beloved face upon recognizing your handwriting after so many months of silence, small comforting fictions you construct entirely without evidence, simply to sustain yourself through the long wait, for any eventual reply. Some prisoners, you have heard through the careful whispered network, never receive any reply at all, their letters vanishing into an unresponsive silence far more painful than the institution's own imposed quiet. A family perhaps too ashamed, too overwhelmed, or too geographically scattered to maintain correspondence across the length of a lengthy sentence, and you find yourself, with each passing week that brings no response to your own careful, censored words, quietly rehearsing how you might absorb that particular disappointment should it eventually prove to be your own fate as well. The stub of pencil itself, worn down to a nub by the time your allotted letter is finally complete, becomes an object of peculiar significance during the writing process, one of the very few implements placed directly and trustingly into your own hands rather than operated under a warder's close supervision. And you find yourself, in a small private moment of something like pleasure, simply enjoying the physical sensation of writing itself, the scratch of graphite against paper, a basic human activity you had never previously considered remarkable, and now treasure precisely because it has become so rare. You find yourself, in the days surrounding each precious letter, unusually tender toward your own memories, replaying entire conversations with your family in careful, loving detail, reconstructing faces and voices with an intensity that borders on the devotional, and you understand, turning your pencil over in your fingers, that this correspondence, however censored, however narrow, however thoroughly filtered through institutional scrutiny, has become one of the genuine load-bearing pillars of your entire capacity to endure the remainder of your sentence. A single thin thread connecting your current grey existence to the considerably warmer, fuller life still waiting, you hope, somewhere beyond these walls. Considerably rarer even than letters, and governed by an even stricter set of conditions, is the actual physical visit, a privilege granted sparingly, typically only after a substantial portion of your sentence has been served, and conducted under circumstances so carefully controlled that the word visit once again, feels almost like a cruel joke by the time you actually experience it. You are led on the appointed day to a small room divided by a wire mesh or wooden partition, sometimes doubled with a considerable gap maintained between the two barriers specifically to prevent any physical contact whatsoever. And it is here, across this careful architectural distance, that you finally see your wife's face again, or your mother's, or whichever family member has made whatever journey was required to reach the prison on the appointed visiting day, a face you have not seen in person for months or years, glimpsed now through mesh and shadow, with a warder standing close enough to monitor every word exchanged between you. The visit itself is brief, often no more than 20 minutes, and conducted under close supervision that permits no private conversation whatsoever, every sentence audible to the attending warder, every topic implicitly restricted by the same unspoken boundaries governing your censored letters, and you find the actual experience considerably more disorienting and, in some strange way, more painful than the letters ever were, because here, at last, is the genuine physical presence of someone you love, close enough to see the small changes time has worked on her face, close enough to hear the particular catch in her voice as she struggles to keep her own composure, and yet entirely, deliberately unreachable, separated by mesh and distance and the ever-present, listening figure of institutional authority standing just behind your shoulder. You struggle, in those brief allotted minutes, to find words adequate to the occasion, painfully aware of how much you want to say and how little of it can actually be spoken aloud under the current circumstances, settling instead for the same careful, restrained territory your letters have already mapped out. Questions about her health, about whatever children or family members could not make the journey themselves, small reassurances about your own condition offered in a tone you hope sounds more convincing than it probably does. She tells you in turn small news from home, carefully filtered, you suspect, to spare you any additional worry beyond what your circumstances already provide in ample supply. And you find yourself hungrily cataloguing every small detail, the particular way she phrases a sentence, a small gesture of her hand against the mesh, storing it all away as precious material to sustain you through the long silent months until whatever future visit might eventually be granted. The warder standing nearby with the studied indifference of a man who has witnessed this exact scene play out with countless other prisoners and their own visiting families, occasionally interjects to remind you both of the time remaining, a small, brutal intrusion into what already feels like far too brief a window for everything you had hoped to convey. The visit ends, inevitably, far too soon, a warder's firm hand on your shoulder signalling that your allotted minutes have expired, and you are led back toward your cell while your visitor is escorted, presumably, back out through the same gate you yourself passed through so many months earlier, back into a world you can currently only imagine from fragments and second-hand description. The emotional aftermath of these rare visits, prison chaplains and surgeons of the period frequently noted, proved genuinely complicated, prisoners often reporting a kind of delayed, disorienting grief in the days immediately following a family visit, the brief taste of connection somehow making the subsequent return to isolation feel considerably heavier than it had before. A bittersweet arithmetic that some prisoners found made the visits almost not worth the emotional cost, while others, yourself very much included, would not have traded that brief mesh-divided glimpse of a beloved face for anything the institution might otherwise have offered you. You carry the memory of it back to your cell like a small, carefully guarded ember, turning it over repeatedly in the silent hours that follow, grateful and aching in roughly equal measure, already beginning the long, patient count toward whatever distant date might bring you another such visit. You find yourself, in the days that follow, unexpectedly short-tempered and easily unsettled, a fact you attribute at first to simple exhaustion before recognizing, with the same reluctant self-awareness the chaplain has been quietly encouraging in you for months, that you are actually grieving, in a small, contained way, the abrupt loss of a connection you had only just been permitted to briefly touch. A fellow prisoner, glimpsed at chapel some days later, wears an expression you recognise instantly as the same one you yourself carried following your own visit, and you exchange, across the careful architectural distance the chapel stalls enforce, the smallest possible flicker of shared, wordless understanding. Two men separately mourning the same particular, specific ache of having glimpsed freedom and family, only to watch it recede again behind mesh and warder and closing gate. Prison reform societies of the era occasionally argued, with genuine conviction, for more frequent and more humane visiting arrangements, contending that regular, meaningful family contact might actually support, rather than undermine, the goal of eventual rehabilitation, a position that met with considerable institutional resistance from officials still deeply committed to the separate system's founding principle that outside contamination, even from a beloved and law-abiding family member, risked undoing the careful isolation upon which the entire theory rested. You have no particular stake in that distant policy argument, occupied instead with the entirely immediate personal task of simply surviving the weeks and months stretching out ahead of you until whatever date the prison's own calendar eventually determines you have earned another such visit. You find yourself, in the weeks following, treating the memory of that brief visit with an almost superstitious care, reluctant to examine it too closely or too often, for fear of somehow wearing the details thin through overuse, rationing your recollection of her face, her voice, the particular way her hand pressed briefly against the mesh. The way you once rationed a childhood sweet you wanted desperately to make last. It is a strange economy, this careful hoarding of memory, and yet it strikes you, turning it over during the long silent hours of your labour, as perhaps the single most sensible financial decision available to a man whose every other resource has been so thoroughly and deliberately stripped away. At last, after months or years measured out in bells and bowls of skilly, in crank revolutions and treadwheel steps, in silent chapel stalls and rare mesh-divided visits, the morning finally arrives when a warder unlocks your cell and informs you, in the same flat, procedural tone that has governed every other announcement of your entire sentence, that today you are to be discharged. You are led back to the reception block where your entire ordeal first began, and there, waiting in a wrapped bundle tagged with the same number assigned to you on your very first day, sit your own original clothes, the ones you arrived in, now musty and somewhat out of fashion after their long confinement in prison storage, smelling faintly of the storeroom rather than of your old life, but nonetheless unmistakably, gloriously your own, rather than institutional grey wool marked with a government arrow. You dress slowly, savouring the strange, almost overwhelming sensation of clothing chosen rather than assigned, fingers fumbling slightly over buttons that suddenly feel unfamiliar after so long spent in garments that never quite fit properly in the first place, and you catch a glimpse of yourself in whatever small mirror the reception room provides, startled by how different you look. Thinner, certainly, your hands roughened and scarred from oakum and crank labour in ways that will take considerable time to fully soften. Your expression carrying something in it that was not there on the morning you first arrived. A wariness, a weight, a kind of hard-won knowledge about exactly how thoroughly an institution can reshape a person given sufficient time and sufficiently patient. Methods. A small sum of money, whatever gratuity the prison authorities have determined you have earned through your labour, minus whatever deductions the system's particular accounting has applied, is pressed into your hand, along with whatever official discharge papers confirm that your debt to the law, as currently defined by Victorian jurisprudence, has been formally settled. You are given, in some cases, a rail ticket toward your home parish, and occasionally, depending on the particular institution and the philanthropic societies operating in connection with it, a brief interview with a representative of one of the era's prisoner aid societies, earnest, well-meaning organisations attempting, with distinctly mixed results, to help discharged prisoners find honest employment in a society that remains, on the whole, deeply and often permanently suspicious of anyone bearing the visible or rumoured stain of a prison sentence. You walk, finally, back through the same reception corridors that first swallowed you so many months or years earlier, and you emerge through the small door cut into the enormous main gate. The very same door into a London that has, you quickly discover, continued entirely indifferently on its own course throughout your entire absence. Carriages rattling past, hawkers calling their wares, ordinary people going about ordinary business with a casual, unconscious freedom that strikes you, in this first disorienting moment, as almost unbearably strange to witness after so long confined within walls that permitted you none of it. The adjustment ahead of you, you understand even in this first dazzling, overwhelming moment of release, will not be simple or quick. Former prisoners of the era frequently described a genuine, lingering difficulty readjusting to the ordinary sensory chaos of free life, the noise, the crowds, the sheer unstructured freedom of choosing your own actions without a bell dictating every transition, sensations that many found disorienting rather than immediately joyful after months or years spent under the separate system's rigid, silent architecture. You flinch on your very first evening of freedom at the sound of a stranger's raised voice nearby, some deep institutional habit of wariness not yet ready to release its grip on your nervous system. You find yourself waking automatically at the hour the prison bell would have rung, lying in whatever bed you have found yourself in, momentarily confused by the absence of the sound that structured your entire existence for so long. Employment, too, proves considerably harder to secure than you might have hoped. Employers wary of your history, some demanding explanations you would rather not provide, and you understand gradually that your sentence, technically complete according to the official paperwork, now folded carefully in your pocket, will continue in certain quieter, less visible ways for a good while yet. And yet, walking those first uncertain steps away from the prison gate, feeling genuine sunlight on your face without a warder timing your allotted half hour, hearing, astonishingly, another human voice speak to you directly, without fear of punishment for the mere act of answering, you feel something loosen in your chest that has been held tight for longer than you can properly measure. Whatever the system's architects believed they were accomplishing behind those high brick walls, whatever combination of genuine reform and genuine damage those months of silence and labour actually worked upon you, you carry forward from this gate a fierce, quiet, entirely private resolve never, under any circumstances, to see the inside of that gatehouse again, and you walk on. Into a London indifferent to your ordeal but blessedly, gloriously loud, chaotic, unstructured, and finally, gratefully, entirely your own. You pause, a short distance from the prison gate, and permit yourself one last look back at the high brick walls now receding behind you, the same walls that looked so impossibly tall on the morning of your arrival, and now seem, somehow, smaller, more ordinary, just another building among the many buildings of London, rather than the entire, all-consuming universe they occupied for the length of your sentence. Somewhere behind those walls, other men are currently climbing the treadwheel, turning the crank, picking apart tarry rope with fingers destined to crack and bleed exactly as your own once did. An entire silent, ongoing machinery of suffering that will continue operating in your absence exactly as smoothly as it operated in your presence, indifferent as institutions tend to be to any single individual's arrival or departure. You think, walking on, of the particular men whose faces you glimpsed but whose names you never learned, the fellow new arrival who shuffled beside you into reception all those months ago, the neighbour in the adjoining cell whose cough you came to recognise through the thick stone wall separating you, the masked figures who walked their own endless circles alongside you in the exercise yard, and you carry them with you, in some small private way, out through the gate and into your new life, a silent, invisible fellowship of shared suffering that no censored letter, no partitioned chapel stall, no institutional rule could ever quite manage to fully erase. Whatever this system intended to make of you, you understand. Walking those first 3 steps toward whatever remains of your old life, that you have arrived on the other side of it, still capable of feeling, still capable of remembering, still, against every careful architectural effort to convince you otherwise, still entirely and stubbornly yourself. And that, dear listener, is what it actually meant to wake up inside a Victorian prison. A system built not by cartoonish villains, but by earnest, well-meaning reformers so convinced of their own theories that they built an entire architecture of silence, solitude, and pointless repetitive labour around the sincere belief that suffering, precisely measured and carefully documented, could scrub a soul clean. You climbed a wheel that led nowhere. You turned a crank that produced nothing. You picked apart tarry rope until your fingers cracked, stitched mailbags with hands still raw from yesterday's labour, and sat in a chapel stall built specifically so you could not see the face of the man weeping quietly 2 feet away from you. You learned to say good morning with your eyebrows, to treat a chaplain's 15 minutes as the highlight of your week, to guard a single censored letter like it was the last warm coal in a dying fire. And through all of it, somehow, thousands upon thousands of real men and women endured exactly this, year after year, decade after decade, and walked back out through that gate still recognisably, stubbornly themselves, carrying forward whatever fragments of resilience, humour, and quiet defiance the system never quite managed to grind out of them. It is worth sitting with that resilience for a moment before you drift off tonight, because the real people who lived this, not the exaggerated version we have gently poked fun at together this evening, but the actual frightened, hungry, aching human beings behind every number in every ledger, deserve to be remembered as more than a punchline. They survived a system explicitly engineered to break them, and a great many of them did not break. Not entirely, not permanently, and that quiet, unglamorous survival is its own kind of remarkable history. So as you settle into your own soft bed tonight, mattress properly cushioned, blankets that were washed sometime this century, free to roll over, mutter to yourself, hum a little tune, or chat with whoever happens to be lying next to you without a warder sliding open a hatch to object. Take just a moment to appreciate how far we have come. No plank beds. No silent masks in the exercise yard. No crank machine bolted to your bedroom wall, thankfully. Just you. Warm, safe, comfortable, and entirely free to fall asleep exactly whenever your own body decides it is ready. Let the last thought you carry with you tonight be a small, grateful one. For warmth, for softness, for silence you actually chose yourself. Good night, sleep well, and I will see you in the next one.